Their romance started out in the fast lane.
They met on the side of the highway. They were giggling and gesturing at each other.
It wasn't long before their passion kicked into high gear.
Tamika was falling for Quincy. He was very charming to her.
When they got married and had children, their life seemed more perfect than ever.
Everyone commented on how they thought they had the perfect family.
Until one of them fell victim to a horrendous crime.
It's very rare to have a murder like this.
In order to solve the crime, investigators will have to unravel a twisted tale of deceit and revenge.
I have never experienced a death like this.
And determine how a collision of desires became a roadmap for murder.
We were, horrified. Our worst fears were coming true.
July 22nd, 2006. As the sun dawns over the San Francisco suburb of Daly City, Shireen Mack pulls into the driveway of the home where her daughter Tamika and son-in-law Quincy Norton live with their 2 children. Shireen is worried. Tamika was supposed to have met her earlier that morning at a funeral for a family friend, but she never showed.
We kept calling, and no one was able to get a hold of her from the house or the cell phone.
Calls to Tamika's husband Quincy have also gone unanswered. Worried her daughter might be in some sort of trouble, Shireen contacts the local police.
This is Shireen Mack. I'm concerned about my daughter, Tamika.
We were dispatched to the Norton's home to do a welfare check on Tamika Norton.
When officers arrive, they use a spare key from a neighbor to enter the front door.
Police department! Miss Norton!
We entered, we checked in the kitchen area, and we checked in the living room.
The officers find no sign of Tamika or her family anywhere in the house, until they come to the master bedroom.
As soon as we opened the door, we saw a female on the ground in front of the bed, and it was a pool of blood under her.
It's Tamika Norton. Police check her vital signs, but there's no saving her.
She did not have any pulse, and she didn't appear to be breathing.
It's a gruesome scene, but what exactly happened? And where was the rest of Tamika's family? The answer to those questions would plunge investigators headlong down a path of unthinkable darkness. A path that would expose a blistering tale of murder, intrigue, and an all-American love story gone horribly awry. Raised in San Francisco, Tamika Mack was the second of 5 daughters born to Shireen and William Mack. Precocious and quick-witted, there was nothing Tamika loved more than to put a smile on her siblings' faces.
Tamika definitely had quite a sense of humor. She always had you laughing.
By high school, Tamika was getting noticed for more than just her sense of humor. Her statuesque good looks turned heads wherever she went. But Tamika was picky about the men she chose to date.
She was very confident. She knew what she wanted.
What Tamika wanted more than anything was to go to school to become a nurse. But midway through her freshman year at college, a chance encounter on the highway would send her life speeding in an entirely new direction.
It was 1996, and Tamika was going down to East Palo Alto with some friends.
A man pulls on the side of her car and flags her, waves at her to pull over.
Worried the man was trying to warn her about something wrong with her vehicle, Tamika pulled over into the emergency lane. So did the man who flagged her down. But when he approached her car, it wasn't to tell her about a busted taillight or a missing gas cap.
Hey.
Hey, is everything okay?
Yeah, I just couldn't think of a better way to get your number.
Tamika was flattered and asked the man his name. It was Quincy Norton. Tall, dark, handsome. Quincy immediately caught Tamika's eye.
Quincy Norton was a big guy. He was charismatic.
nice looking.
Tamika found Quincy very attractive, so they exchanged numbers.
Less than 24 hours after their initial roadside rendezvous, Quincy called Tamika and asked her out. From the moment of their first date, it was clear the chemistry between them was palpable.
I was watching you all. What about it? So sexy.
They started doing what people do in a normal relationship, going out, went to the movies, bowling, hanging out.
Tamika found herself drawn to Quincy's confidence, and she liked that he was career-minded, working as a manager for a local grocery store chain. In fact, it wasn't long before Tamika confided in her sisters that she was falling in love with Quincy.
Tamika and Quincy's relationship started pretty quickly. They both were very attracted to one another. It seemed like it took off pretty fast.
So fast that just a few months into their relationship, Tamika made a surprise announcement. She and Quincy were expecting.
Tamika was so excited to be a mom. She always talked about being a mother.
In 1997, Tamika gave birth to a son named Jalen. Both she and Quincy were thrilled to be parents. So much so that less than a year later, the couple had another son, Jamal. With 2 young boys and a loving relationship that only seemed to grow stronger by the day, Tamika and Quincy decided to get married in September of 2004. The family then moved into a cozy 3-bedroom house in the San Francisco suburb of Daly City, the kind of dream home Tamika and Quincy longed to raise their family in.
They were just very happy. Everyone commented on how they thought they had the perfect family.
A cozy new home, a loving marriage, 2 beautiful young children. From the outside looking in, Tamika and Quincy Norton had it all. Which makes the terrifying discovery in the couple's house the afternoon of July 22, 2006, that much harder to fathom.
They found Tamika in the bedroom, dead, and there was just a whole lot of blood everywhere.
It doesn't take officers long to determine the gruesome cause of death.
It was pretty obvious to anybody with any experience there'd been a stabbing.
As police survey the nightmarish scene, they're confronted by a series of disturbing questions. Namely, how did Tamika end up dead on her master bedroom floor? And more importantly, where are her husband and 2 young children?
The questions I was asking in my mind is, now that we found that one body, are we going to find additional bodies?
Police scour the house, but find no sign of Quincy or the Nortons' children. Meanwhile, investigators are now faced with the difficult task of informing Tamika's family of her death.
Your daughter is gone, man.
We all just took a step back and everyone just went hysterical. My mother collapsed on the ground. We had family members running, falling in the street, screaming. It was just a chaotic scene.
While neighbors try to console Tamika's loved ones, police put out an APB for Quincy Norton and the couple's missing children.
The children were gone, and that was a matter of very great concern. It was a very serious effort to try and locate them.
But before Quincy and the kids can be located, investigators have to untangle an intricate web of lies and betrayal, and in the process, unveil a deadly love triangle no one expects. A new home in a nice neighborhood, 2 healthy young children, and a passionate marriage. Things couldn't have been better for Tamika and Quincy Norton. But on the morning of July 22, 2006, that picture-perfect life is cut tragically short. Police have discovered the body of Tamika Norton dead on her bedroom floor, the victim of a vicious knife attack. Police have also learned that Quincy and the couple's 2 young children have vanished without a trace.
Of course, our concern is for the welfare of the small children as well as the whereabouts of their father.
It was very scary not knowing where the boys was at. We didn't know if they had been harmed, if they were going to be missing for a long time.
While patrol officers fan out in search of Quincy and the children, homicide investigators began searching the crime scene for evidence that might lead them to Tamika's killer. In the home's garage, detectives come across the first clue.
We checked for Tamika's vehicle. Her vehicle was not there.
The missing car suggests two very different possibilities. That Quincy and the kids weren't home at the time Tamika was attacked, or that the murderer had stolen the Nortons' vehicle and forced the crime's eyewitnesses to accompany him.
Somebody had committed this murder, in which case they would have been in the hands of strangers.
If the second theory is correct, it suggests that Tamika's death might be the byproduct of a botched robbery. But that theory can't explain why, beyond the bloody scene in the bedroom, nothing else in the house appears to have been disturbed.
Even in the bedrooms and the living room, everything was neat and orderly.
Nor does there appear to be any sign of forced entry into the house.
To me, it appeared that someone either entered into the residence with a key and left with a key, or maybe a remote through the garage door opener.
But who with easy access to the Nortons' home would want to harm Tamika, Quincy, or the kids? Police posed that question to Tamika's mother and sisters.
Is there anyone you know may have had issue with Tamika?
No, everybody loved Tamika. Everybody loved my sister.
Tamika's family might have been stumped. But that afternoon, investigators find a telling clue.
There was evidence of blood near the sink. Whoever had done the stabbing had cleaned up at the sink.
But exactly what had been cleaned? Following the blood trail across the counter, investigators key in on a nearby knife block, which contained a couple of knives that appeared to have blood on them.
There were several knives that we paid particular attention to. All those items were collected by the San Mateo County Crime Lab.
Any or all of them could have been involved in the killing. So they processed and gathered all of the knives.
Meanwhile, news of Tamika's shocking homicide and the apparent abduction of Quincy and the kids begins to spread through the Bay Area.
The news media became aware of the incident and began to post information regarding our request in an effort to locate Quincy Norton and the children.
They were canvassing areas looking for them. They were waiting for people to call.
As the search for Quincy and the children drags on, Tamika's family begins to fear the worst.
We pretty much thought that they met the same demise as their mother.
But just as hope was beginning to fade, police receive a tip from an informant. But it's not related to Quincy or the children's whereabouts. It's about a possible suspect in Tamika's murder. The informant tells police they should take a look at a woman from Quincy Norton's past, a woman named Anitra Johnson.
Anitra Johnson was a childhood friend of Quincy's.
But according to the informant,
Hey!
Anitra and Quincy had grown to be more than just old friends.
Can I see you later?
You better stop now.
While he was in a relationship with Tamika, he was having an affair with her.
The news piques detectives' interest, but that's when the informant drops an even bigger bombshell about Quincy and Anitra.
She explained that Anitra Johnson and Quincy Norton did in fact have a 5-year-old daughter in common.
When asked to confirm the jaw-dropping revelation, Tamika's family admits that it's true. In fact, not long after Quincy and Anitra got together, Anitra called Tamika and dropped this bombshell.
It ain't his kid. Oh, best believe.
Anitra called Tamika to let her know that she was still involved with Quincy and that she was 9 months pregnant with his child. And she came to the address to let her know.
Hello, to be doing here. What do you mean what I'm doing here? You didn't want to talk to me on the phone, so I came to show you the evidence. 9 months, and it's Quincy.
It is not his kid.
Yes, it is.
According to Tamika's family, Quincy begged her for forgiveness.
I'm sorry. All I want is...
How can I trust you? How can I trust that you won't do this again?
Just believe me. I promise you.
And swore he'd immediately break things off with Anitra. While heartbroken by Quincy's betrayal, Tamika ultimately decided to stay with her husband.
All I want is...
Tamika was upset about that, but she wanted to save her family and continue their relationship.
But Tamika's family told investigators that while Tamika had been willing to forgive Quincy and begin the work of rebuilding their marriage, Tamika still harbored a grudge against Anitra. A grudge that only got worse after Anitra and Quincy's love child was born.
The women hated each other. They would regularly cuss each other out on the telephone.
Don't you ever call my husband again.
Both seemed to be ready to fight for their man.
Police can't help but wonder, had Tamika's long simmering feud with Anitra finally erupted into murder and ultimately put Quincy and the couple's children in harm's way? The only way for investigators to find out is to bring Anitra Johnson in for questioning. And when they do, what Anitra says will send the case spiraling into a new and even more unthinkable direction. For more than 10 years, handsome husband and wife Quincy and Tamika Norton were living the dream life. But in 2006, that life turned into a nightmare. Police had found Tamika stabbed to death in the couple's bedroom, while Quincy and their 2 young children were missing and presumed kidnapped.
We were just afraid for the children. If their mother had been killed, what did that mean for them?
Following an anonymous tip, police are now circling a possible suspect. Quincy's former mistress and Tamika's nemesis, 32-year-old Anitra Johnson.
Anitra Johnson was a childhood friend of Quincy's, and they had had an affair, and it produced a daughter.
Police track Anitra down and bring her back to the station for questioning. Anitra admits she and Tamika aren't exactly best friends.
Did you and Tamika get along?
No. They didn't like each other, but they did have arguments over Quincy.
But when police inform Anitra that Tamika has been murdered, Anitra appears genuinely shocked.
What if I was to tell you that Tamika was discovered in her home last night?
Really? She also vehemently denies any involvement with the murder or the disappearances of Quincy and the kids.
No, I had no idea.
In order to prove her innocence, Anitra offers up an alibi.
I was at work last night.
What time did you leave?
I got up around 9.
Pressed on her whereabouts the evening before the murder, Anitra claims she was home. But what she says next floors detectives.
Were you alone?
For a little while, but Quincy came over.
The night prior to Tamika Norton's murder, Quincy Norton had spent the evening with her, Anitra Johnson, at her residence in Milpitas.
According to Anitra, even though Quincy had promised to be true to Tamika, he and Anitra had recently rekindled their affair.
Quincy and I have been seeing each other a lot for the past couple of months.
Did Tamika know about this?
I don't think so.
Anitra tells police that the night before Tamika's murder, Quincy came over to her place around 9 p.m. The two of them went right to the bedroom where they had a passionate sexual encounter. Afterward, Anitra decided the time was right to ask Quincy to take their relationship to the next level.
I missed you. I want to see you every day. When are you going to leave her?
You did want him to leave to me.
I wanted him to leave Tamika, but he said he was not going to leave Tamika and his family.
It's not even an option. I'm not even going to talk about this.
According to Anitra, Quincy told her that as long as his children were around, he and Tamika would never separate, and Anitra would always be the other woman.
He said he was going to get back with Tamika, that in fact he was not leaving her, there was not going to be a divorce.
Then, without saying another word, Quincy put his clothes back on and headed home.
Anitra Johnson explained that Quincy Norton left her residence at about 4:30 a.m.
As for where Quincy went next, Anitra claims she doesn't know and swears she hasn't heard from him since. But her statement gets investigators thinking. If Anitra got rid of Tamika, she would have Quincy all to herself.
What do you think?
Well, it's pretty suspicious.
But if Anitra did have a hand in Tamika's murder, did she also play a role in Quincy and the children's disappearance? If so, where are they now? Before investigators can even consider that question, a new witness walks into the police station. It's none other than Tamika's sister, Nicole Menace.
I wanted to be as helpful as I could at that point.
Nicole advises investigators to take a closer look at her sister's marriage to Quincy.
I hate to be the one to point fingers or anything like that, but have you looked at her husband, Quincy?
Turns out, Quincy's affair with Anitra Johnson wasn't the only dark chapter in the couple's romance. Quincy was convinced that Tamika was cheating on him too.
I know I shouldn't say anything, but this isn't the first time that, well, Quincy always thought that she was the one that was having an affair.
It got so bad, he would come to my home searching for her and searching through all the bedrooms looking for the man I was hiding for her.
According to Nicole, Quincy's obsession with Tamika's alleged infidelity led him to confront her on more than one occasion.
This particular night, he came home. She was asleep in the bed. And there was no conversation. He just came in because she was asleep. All she could make out was he was just saying, "Why are you cheating on me? Why are you doing this to me?"
Who is he?
Who's who?
Who are you cheating on me with?
Is it possible Quincy's suspicions were correct?
I am not cheating on you.
Yes, you are. What's his name?
There is nobody.
You think I'm stupid?
Was Tamika really seeing someone else?
There is nobody.
I know you're cheating. You're never anywhere you say you are.
If that's the case, could Tamika's mystery lover have something to do with her murder? Or the possible abduction of Quincy and the kids? Before investigators can answer those questions, new evidence would come to light. Evidence that makes police question everything they thought they knew about the Norton family, about Anitra Johnson, about the death of Tamika McNorton, and about what really happened to Quincy and the kids. Tamika and Quincy Norton's relationship was born from a chance encounter that quickly morphed into a storybook romance. But on July 22, 2006, police discovered Tamika Norton brutally stabbed to death in the master bedroom of their home. Even more terrifying is the fact that Quincy and the couple's 2 young children are missing and possibly dead.
The concerns at this point were that the children themselves were in danger. Nobody knew where they were.
It was very scary, not knowing where the boys was at. We didn't know if they had been harmed, if they were going to be missing for a long time.
While officers scour the Bay Area for any sign of Quincy and the kids, a team of detectives is focused on tracking down Tamika's killer. After a series of surprising revelations, investigators have begun to circle around 2 possible suspects. Anitra Johnson, Quincy's on-again, off-again mistress and mother of his illegitimate child, or this mysterious man Quincy suspected Tamika might be sleeping with. But before detectives can determine if Tamika's secret boyfriend was real or just a figment of Quincy's imagination, they get another surprise visit from Tamika's sister, Nicole Menace. Nicole tells police she's just gotten the call she and everyone else have been waiting for. It was from Tamika and Quincy's oldest son, Jalen.
Do you have your brother with you? Are you safe? Okay, sweetie, where are you?
My nephew said that he was with his brother and they were being driven back to my home. He needed to have directions how to get there, to lead the driver to my home.
According to Jalen, he and his brother Jamal are safe.
All right, have them take you to my house, and I'll come pick you up right there, okay? So you stay there.
For Tamika's worried family, the good news
Bring them back here.
couldn't have come at a moment too soon.
It was a big sigh of relief to know that they were unharmed and they were going to be returned to us.
The call from young Jalen raised as many questions as it provided answers. Namely, who were the kids with, and where was their father Quincy? According to what Jalen told his aunt Nicole Menace over the phone, he and his brother Jamal had been staying with a family friend for the last 2 days, ever since their father abruptly dropped them off there early Saturday morning.
The children had been dropped off at an extended family friend's home in San Mateo by Quincy Norton.
But why would Quincy drop his kids off and not come back? And where was he now? To answer those questions, police needed to talk to the 2 boys. Once the boys are safely back in her custody, police asked Tamika's sister Nicole Menace to bring Jalen and Jamal down to the station. Sitting down with the boys, detectives asked them to explain why their dad dropped them off at a family friend's house. While clearly nervous, the boys tell investigators that it all started around 6:30 a.m. when Jalen was startled awake by his mother's voice screaming out his name.
He left his bedroom, crossed the hallway, and looked in through the open door.
In his parents' bedroom, Jalen says he saw something that shocked him.
He explained he saw his mother laying on her back on her bed and his father standing over her.
Jalen says he slowly backed out of the room, but before he could leave, his father turned his head to speak to him. And what Jalen saw terrified him.
He thought his father had been drinking because when he came into the room and saw his father holding his mother down, his father had red eyes.
Go back to bed!
Jalen says he ran back to his room, crawled into bed with his brother Jamal, and told him about the nightmare he'd just witnessed. By that point, their mother's screams had stopped, but the silence was soon broken by an equally disturbing sound.
The younger boy recalled hearing some sort of commotion, as if, I believe he described it as if somebody had fallen to the ground.
A few moments later, the boys say their father entered their bedroom.
Their father came out and said, "Come on, boys, we're going to leave."
Hey, boys, come on. You guys got to get up. Let's go. Come on, get your stuff. Let's go. I need you guys. Come on.
But before leaving the house, Jamal made one last request.
I want to say bye to Mom.
No, we don't have time for that. Come on.
Quincy told him no, he couldn't go in there.
Quincy then loaded the children into the car, drove across town, and dropped them off at a family friend's house. According to the boys, their father didn't say where he was going, but he promised he'd be back for them later. Jalen and Jamal never saw their father again. The boys' story is heartbreaking, but it paints a clear picture of the crime's new prime suspect.
Quincy Norton was considered a suspect in the murder of Tamika Norton.
Investigators put out a new APB for Quincy, this time as a man wanted for murder.
It was very important to me for them to find Quincy so we can get the answers that we needed.
What police didn't then know was before they could track down Quincy, they'd be blindsided with another surprise revelation. One that will have everyone second-guessing Quincy Norton's guilt and ask if the real killer was pulling the strings, trying to frame Quincy for the crime all along. Everyone who knew Tamika Mack and Quincy Norton thought the two were destined for a lifetime of happiness. But after listening to the horrific eyewitness account of the couple's two young sons, Jalen and Jamal, detectives are now convinced that Quincy murdered Tamika in a jealous rage and is now on the run. It's a theory that gains even more traction when detectives get a call from the coroner's office about a piece of evidence they discovered in one of Tamika's pants pockets.
When Ms. Norton's body was removed from the scene, they found in her pocket a card from a divorce lawyer.
We were sitting in the car together, and Tamika told me she was going to divorce Quincy, and she was done. She was tired, and she couldn't do it anymore, and that she had already started the process.
Tamika had reached a point where she realized that she needed to do something different, so she thought about divorce.
The discovery seems to offer further proof that a jealous and obsessive Quincy decided to kill his wife rather than allow her to divorce him.
What I understand to be the motive in a case like this, it's power and control. And when it appears that the victim is going to break off the relationship or is trying to break off the relationship, it's the most critical and dangerous time because you're directly threatening that which the batterer wants the most, which is power.
It seems all that is left now is to hunt down Quincy Norton and bring him to justice. Unfortunately, the last time anyone saw Quincy was more than 3 days ago when he dropped his children off at the home of a family friend. Detectives decide to turn to the one person Quincy might have reached out to, his mistress and the mother of his illegitimate child, Anitra Johnson.
We thought, in fact, she'd been playing a double game, but she'd been helping Quincy stay at large.
When police bring Anitra back for questioning, she denies having had any contact with Quincy.
Why do I feel like you're not telling us the whole thing?
But when they threaten Anitra with obstruction of justice charges and a hefty prison sentence, she has a sudden change of heart.
Okay, wait.
According to Anitra, Quincy called shortly after dropping off his kids. Quincy told Anitra that he needed help, and he gave her some very specific instructions.
He told me to meet him at the airport so I could rent him a car.
We would later learn in speaking with Anitra Johnson that she did meet with Quincy Norton, at which time he took the vehicle from her.
But where had Quincy gone in the rental car? Anitra swears she doesn't know. And with no other clues to his whereabouts, investigators turn to the media, hoping viewers in the San Francisco Bay Area might have spotted Quincy or his rental car.
The news coverage during the manhunt was quite extensive. The phrase "Peninsula Killer" was used in the headlines.
But despite the media blitz, days pass with no information. In the meantime, Tamika's family holds a memorial service for her, with sons Jalen and Jamal looking on. Their mother is laid to rest in Cypress Lawn Cemetery. Then finally, on August 27th, more than a month after Tamika's murder, there's a break in the case. It starts when detectives are contacted by an anonymous caller who claims to have spotted Quincy Norton's rental car outside a rundown apartment complex in nearby San Jose. Investigators relay the information to the San Jose Police Department. A few hours later, they get the call they've been waiting for.
August 27th, we received a call from San Jose Police Department stating that they had arrested Quincy Norton.
He was standing there waiting for a bus, and police approached him and just took him into custody without incident.
Hauled back to Daly City, Quincy's booked on murder charges for the savage death of his wife. His mistress, Anitra Johnson, is also charged for aiding in his escape. For Tamika's family, the fact that the father of her children has been charged with her murder is nothing short of devastating.
I was shocked to think that he would really do that because he seemed to be so obsessed with her, and that's such a final act. I just couldn't wrap my brain around it. It's a mixture of feelings, just angry, sad, really hard to stay composed.
Quincy Norton's trial is scheduled to begin in early 2008. With the Norton children's own testimony as the cornerstone of their case, prosecutors are confident they'll secure a conviction. But that changes when police get an unexpected call from the crime lab. Apparently, the kitchen knives collected from the Norton home had been thoroughly analyzed. There's 2 sets of DNA on the murder weapon.
Tamika was the one who had the majority of the DNA on the knife.
But that's not the shocking part. The second DNA profile, presumably that of the murderer, doesn't belong to Quincy Norton.
There was no DNA from Quincy Norton. There was DNA from Anitra Johnson, as well as DNA from Tamika Norton.
It's earth-shattering evidence and suggests that Anitra Johnson, not Quincy Norton, is Tamika's true killer.
That suggested, of course, that the defense might well try and blame it on Anitra. And, of course, Anitra and Tamika had had some encounters before, and that there was bad blood between the two for obvious reasons.
There aren't that many trials that I've covered where you kind of have that, oh my goodness, big moment.
In an instant, the state's once rock-solid case is now on extremely shaky footing and has everyone wondering, is an innocent man about to stand trial for a crime he didn't commit? In the summer of 2006, the brutal slaying of 32-year-old wife and mother Tamika Norton stunned the San Francisco Bay Area.
We were horrified that our worst fears were coming true.
Even more shocking is the news that Tamika's husband, Quincy Norton, has been charged with the murder. But the most jaw-dropping revelation occurs on the eve of Quincy's murder trial. DNA evidence from the murder weapon has come back from the crime lab. According to the results, Quincy's DNA is nowhere to be found on the knife. Instead, the crime lab finds DNA matching Quincy's longtime mistress, Anitra Johnson.
Her DNA was on the handle of the murder weapon. When I heard that Anitra Johnson's DNA was on the knife, I thought the case would probably be in jeopardy because that's reasonable doubt.
Once the knife evidence came out, Quincy's attorney, Ms. Fox, told me and everyone else in the media she expected the prosecutors to drop all charges right then and arrest Anitra.
But rather than drop the murder charges against Quincy and pursue heftier charges against Anitra, the state announces they'll proceed with his trial. It is amidst this chaos and controversy that the state of California versus Quincy Norton begins. Prosecutors opened their case by painting Quincy as a violent and controlling husband, whose own infidelity pushed his marriage with Tamika to the edge. An edge Quincy went over when he learned of Tamika's plans to divorce him.
Prosecution's opening statement was that Quincy was very jealous and controlling, and when he found out that she was going to divorce him, that was the last straw, and he killed her.
According to prosecutors, in the early morning hours of July 22nd, Quincy started drinking heavily and began entertaining paranoid fantasies that Tamika was cheating on him. Prosecutors claimed that an inebriated Quincy then entered the couple's bedroom where Tamika was asleep. Shaking Tamika awake, Quincy began to berate her with accusations of infidelity.
Who are you sleeping
Get out
with?
of the way. I'm sick of this.
Who is it?
Tamika in turn told Quincy she wanted a divorce, to which Quincy replied by strangling her. But before Quincy could finish the job, he was interrupted by his son Jalen.
The boy saw his mother laying on her back on her bed and his father standing over her.
Prosecutors assert that Quincy told his son to go back to bed.
Go back to bed, now!
Then once Jalen was gone, Quincy went to the kitchen, retrieved a knife, and stabbed Tamika to death.
I've never experienced a death like this or a crime like this.
It was a terrible, brutal crime.
To bolster their claim, prosecutors called their two key witnesses to the stand, Tamika and Quincy's two young sons, Jalen and Jamal. One after the other, the two boys described to the jury the horror of seeing their father attack their mother as she screamed for help. And then the terrible sound that followed. The sound prosecutors claim was that of Tamika's lifeless body hitting the floor.
I've covered a lot of murder trials, but the testimony of the children was the most difficult thing I've had to watch during a murder trial.
Jalen and Jamal's turns on the witness stand are indeed gut-wrenching and seem to cement the state's case against their father. But when the defense opens their case, they claim Quincy Norton is a man wrongfully accused, and the true killer is in fact the same woman whose DNA was found on the murder weapon, Quincy's lover, Anitra Johnson.
The defense's opening statement was raising a lot of doubt and a lot of concern, particularly about that knife. The defense implied that Anitra had a role in her death, that Anitra was pretty much all but guilty.
It's a compelling argument and seems to plant at least a seed of reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. But in their closing arguments, the prosecution counters with a unique explanation of how Anitra's DNA could have been transferred to the knife without her ever wielding it.
What I used for the transfer was I shook hands with my inspector and picked up a book and said, now, if I put this book anywhere, I could take this book back to my office and my inspector's DNA could be in my office and he might never have been in my office.
They said that Quincy transferred the DNA without actually shedding any of his own.
Despite the explanation from prosecutors, Tamika's family worries that when the jury breaks for deliberation, the verdict could go either way.
It was very stressful, the idea of putting his fate into 12 strangers' hands.
6 long days later, the jury returns with their decision.
The jury convicted Mr. Norton of first-degree murder with the use of a knife.
The conviction carries a sentence of 26 years to life. Tamika's family is relieved by the decision.
We're all holding hands and just shaking and crying, trying to stay composed, but just very, very emotional.
But their joy is tempered with a sense that Quincy's punishment, while stiff, doesn't fit the crime.
I was happy that he received a first-degree conviction, but 26 years to life is just not long enough. In 26 years, he can be eligible for parole. And Tamika no longer has a life.
Their disappointment is doubled when they learn that Anitra Johnson was granted immunity for her cooperation with the prosecutors. In fact, several of those most familiar with the case suspect that Anitra might have been more than just an accessory to the crime.
If Quincy's not on the knife and Anitra is on the knife, you have to ask yourself, how did that happen?
It's this combination of suspicion and sadness that continues to hang over the case like a dark cloud, serving as a constant reminder that one fateful morning, a man fueled by alcohol and blinded by jealousy and rage murdered the love of his life, the mother of his children, and either with or without the help of his mistress, murdered an innocent woman.
I would have never thought this would happen to Tamika, never in a million years. In the beginning of the relationship, he was so loving. You could tell they both were in love with each other, and he just adored her. It just turned into something that was the total opposite of that.
It started with a sound no one could place, sharp, metallic, out of rhythm with the desert night. And by the time anyone thought to remember it, the girl was already gone, swallowed by silence, so complete it felt deliberate, like something had decided she no longer belonged to the world that was still searching for her name. June 17th, 2001. Phoenix, Arizona. The heat hadn't broken even after midnight. Asphalt still breathed warmth. Air hung heavy, unmoving, pressing down on a quiet suburban street where nothing ever happened. At least that's what people said later, repeating it like a defense, like if they said enough times, it would erase what came next. Her name was Lila Mercer, 17, honor student, part-time cashier at a grocery store 3 blocks from home. No record, no enemies, no reason. No reason anyone could find for her story to end the way it did, or worse, to not end at all. She left work at 10:42 p.m. Security cameras caught her stepping into the parking lot, adjusting the strap of her bag, glancing once over her shoulder, not fearfully, not dramatically, just a quick look, the kind people make without thinking. That frame would be replayed thousands of times in the years that followed. People would slow it down, zoom in, argue about shadows, about a shape near the edge of the lot, about whether someone was already there, waiting. No one could ever prove it. Her car sat exactly where she'd parked it. Driver's side door unlocked. Keys missing. No signs of struggle. No dropped phone. No scattered belongings. Just absence, clean, precise, almost surgical. A cold case before sunrise. At 11:15 p.m., her mother called. No answer. At 11:22, she called again. By midnight, panic had already taken root, spreading fast, irrational but correct. At 12:37 a.m., police logged the first report, possible missing person. Routine, they said. Teens wander. Teens stay out. Teens don't always come home. But by morning, routine collapsed. Because Lila Mercer had never missed a curfew. Not once. By 8 a.m., detectives were on scene. Yellow tape. Flashing lights. Neighbors watching from behind curtains, whispering, already constructing theories. Boyfriend. Stranger. Runaway. The words came easy. Answers did not. The first search swept the immediate area. Nothing. No footprints in the dry soil that could be distinguished from any other. No witnesses who saw anything clearly enough to matter. One man thought he heard a car door slam. Another insisted he saw headlights lingering too long near the exit. A third claimed he saw nothing at all, but later changed his statement, adding a detail that didn't match the timeline. The contradictions stacked quickly. By day 3, the case had shifted tone. The phrase, missing girl, started sharing space with possible abduction. Reporters picked it up. Local news ran her photo, smiling, bright, painfully alive in contrast to the uncertainty now defining her. Arizona teen vanishes without a trace. Community shocked. Police chase limited leads. The headlines wrote themselves. The story, however, refused to cooperate. Then came the first anomaly. A receipt, time-stamped 11:03 p.m., found crumpled near a drainage ditch less than a mile from the grocery store. Not hers. Different store. Different purchase. Bottled water. Prepaid phone card. Cash transaction. No name. No surveillance footage preserved. It should have meant nothing. Except for one detail. The cashier, when questioned days later, remembered the customer. Not clearly, not enough to identify, but enough to describe something off. Gloves. In June. In Arizona heat that never forgave mistakes like that. Gloves. The word stuck. Investigators pulled every report they could find. Past incidents, suspicious persons, prior complaints. One surfaced, buried in logs from 8 months earlier. A woman reported being followed in the same parking lot. Described a man sitting in a car, engine running, watching. When approached, he drove off. No plate captured. No follow-up. At the time, it was nothing. Now it was everything. The case intensified. Detectives canvassed again, this time with sharper questions, narrower focus. Who had been there before? Who came regularly but never bought anything? Who watched more than they shopped? Patterns began to emerge, or, at least, shapes that resembled patterns if you looked long enough. A dark sedan mentioned twice. Different witnesses. Different days. No confirmation they were the same vehicle. No plate. No driver description that matched. Still, it was something. Days turned to weeks. Weeks stretched thin into months. Leads cooled. Calls slowed. Tips became less precise, more desperate. People wanted to help, but memory is a fragile instrument. It bends under pressure, distorts under repetition. The case file thickened. The trail did not. By winter, the phrase changed. Cold case. It landed heavy, clinical, final without closure. It meant resources shifted. It meant urgency faded. It meant Lila Mercer became a question no one could answer, filed away among others just like it. But the town didn't forget. Not entirely. Every year, on June 17th, candles appeared near the parking lot. Small at first. Then more. Then dozens. Her photo printed on flyers, fading under sun and time, replaced, reprinted, refusing to disappear. People talked about her in lowered voices. Parents tightened curfews. The grocery store installed new cameras, brighter lights, as if illumination could rewrite the past. It couldn't, because what no one knew, what no one even suspected, was that the answer had never left the scene. It had simply never been seen. Not in 2001. Not in 2002. Not in the years that followed, when technology advanced, when cases once thought impossible began to break open under new methods, new eyes. The evidence was there. Waiting. Buried not in the desert, not in some distant location tied to a suspect no one could find, but in something far more ordinary, far more overlooked, something processed, cataloged, dismissed. Until someone made a mistake. Or maybe until someone finally asked the right question. Because cold cases don't always stay cold. Sometimes they smolder. Quiet. Invisible. Until one detail, small, almost irrelevant, catches air. And everything changes. It didn't begin with a confession, or a witness stepping forward after years of silence, or some dramatic late-night phone call that shattered the quiet of a forgotten file room. It began with a box, dust-coated, mislabeled, shoved to the back of a steel shelf where time had done what the investigation could not. Bury it without resolution. Fall, 2019. Maricopa County Evidence Storage. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow over rows of cardboard and sealed plastic, each container holding fragments of lives interrupted, stories paused mid-sentence. Most of them would never be reopened. Most of them didn't have anything left to give. But this one did. The label was wrong. Case number smudged, digits barely legible. It had been cataloged under a related but separate incident, a clerical slip from 2001, unnoticed, uncorrected, and for nearly 2 decades, unchallenged. It should have stayed there, lost in the system. Except a technician new, methodical, unfamiliar with the habits that come from years of assuming older cases are already exhausted, flagged it. Inconsistency. A barcode that didn't align with the database entry. A chain of custody log that stopped abruptly, mid-transfer, with no final sign-off. Not dramatic. Not suspicious on its own. Just incomplete. Incomplete was enough. The box was pulled, opened, reintroduced to light. Inside, standard contents for a missing persons case from the early 2000s. Fabric samples. Swabs. Photographs. A sealed evidence bag containing something that, at the time, had been noted but never prioritized. A length of fiber. Thin. Synthetic. Dark blue. It had been recovered from the driver's side interior of Lila Mercer's car, documented, bagged, then effectively ignored. In 2001, it didn't stand out. Fibers transfer constantly. Cars collect them like dust. Without a suspect to compare against, it was just noise in an already overwhelming field of possibilities. So it stayed there. Until now. The technician didn't know the case history in detail. Didn't know the name Lila Mercer carried weight in certain corners of the department, spoken less often over the years, but never fully erased. What they saw was simpler, an item logged, preserved, and never fully processed using the tools now available. So they ran it. Modern forensic analysis had changed the rules. Materials that once blended into irrelevance could now be isolated, classified, traced back to manufacturing sources, narrowed down to specific product lines, sometimes even specific batches. The fiber went under the microscope. Composition, polyester blend, industrial grade. Not clothing. Not upholstery common to passenger vehicles of that era. Something else. The result didn't solve anything immediately. It didn't produce a name, an address, a suspect waiting conveniently at the end of a data trail. What it did was more dangerous. It introduced a new direction, one that hadn't been explored in 2001 because it didn't exist yet. The file was flagged, reopened, at first quietly. Cold case reviews happen all the time. Most lead nowhere. Old evidence re-examined, old assumptions challenged, and then, more often than not, confirmed. Dead ends, just revisited with better lighting. But this one didn't settle, because the fiber didn't match anything inside Lila's life. Not her clothes, not her car, not her home, not her workplace. It was foreign, and foreign meant introduced, which meant someone or something had brought it there. The question shifted, not just who took Lila Mercer, but what they brought with them. Investigators began reconstructing the scene again, this time through a different lens. Not just movements, not just timelines, but materials, transfers, microevidence that had once been too insignificant to matter. The car was reprocessed. Every surface, every seam, every crevice that had once been dusted, swabbed, then declared clean of anything useful. Technology had changed. Sensitivity increased. Where once there had been nothing, now there were traces, faint, degraded, but real. More fibers. Same type. Clustered near the rear seat. And something else. A partial impression. Not a fingerprint. Not a full print of any kind. Just pressure distortion in the fabric, like something heavy had been placed there briefly, then removed. Or someone. The theory shifted again. Lila hadn't just disappeared from beside her car. She had been inside it. After she was supposed to have left. That detail rippled through the investigation like a shockwave delayed by 18 years. Because it contradicted the original assumption that whatever happened, happened fast, outside, unseen. Now there was a possibility, no, more than a possibility, that she had been contained, even if only for moments, inside a space that had already been searched, already been declared empty of answers. The timeline tightened. 10:42 p.m., last confirmed sighting. 11:03 p.m., receipt found near drainage ditch. Between those points, something had happened that left no witnesses, no clear struggle, no immediate trace except now, belatedly, the suggestion of presence, of movement, of a controlled interaction that had been invisible at the time. The gloves. The cashier's memory, dismissed as vague, now resurfaced with weight. Gloves meant intent. Preparation. Someone who didn't want to leave traces. And yet they had. just not the kind anyone was looking for in 2001. The investigation expanded outward again, but differently this time. Not broad, not desperate, focused. Targeted. Looking for intersections between industrial materials and individuals with access to them. Factories, warehouses, maintenance crews, delivery services. Anyone who worked with materials that matched the fiber profile. The list wasn't small. Arizona in 2001 was full of growth, construction, shipping, expansion. Thousands of workers, thousands of vehicles, thousands of opportunities for overlap. Too many, unless you narrowed it. And that's where the second anomaly surfaced. Buried in the original witness statements, overlooked because it seemed irrelevant, almost trivial at the time, a note from a teenage employee who had been closing up that night. He mentioned a vehicle. Not the dark sedan others talked about. This one was different. A white utility van. Parked not in the main lot, but along the side access road, partially obscured by a line of dumpsters. Engine off. No one seen entering or exiting. At the time, it meant nothing. Vans were common. Service vehicles, delivery units, maintenance crews. No logo remembered. No plate noted.
Just a van.
But now, paired with the fiber, industrial, non-consumer, something that didn't belong inside Lila's personal environment, the van took on a new shape. A container. A mobile space capable of holding equipment or a person. Investigators tracked the statement back. The teenager, now in his mid-30s, was located, re-interviewed. Memory faded, but not gone. He remembered the van because it felt out of place, not its presence, but its stillness. No movement, no lights, just there, watching, or waiting. He couldn't say how long it had been parked. Couldn't say if it was there before Lila came out or only after. Couldn't say if it left before or after she vanished. But he was certain of one thing. It hadn't been there earlier in the evening, which meant it arrived. At some point, for some reason. And then it disappeared. Just like her. The pieces didn't form a complete picture. Not yet. But they began to align in a way they never had before. Separate details, once isolated, now intersecting under the pressure of new evidence.
Fiber. Van.
Gloves. Contained space. Controlled movement. The randomness of the original disappearance began to erode, replaced by something more structured, more deliberate. This wasn't chance. It was method. And methods leave patterns. Even if it takes years, decades, for someone to recognize them. Because somewhere beyond that parking lot, beyond that single night in June, there had to be other signs. Other moments where something almost happened. Other near misses. Other reports that never connected because no one knew what they were looking at. Until now. The file grew again. Not thicker with noise, but sharper with intent. Investigators weren't just asking what happened to Lila Mercer anymore. They were asking something far more dangerous. Who had done something like this before and gotten away with it? Because if the answer existed, and statistically it almost had to, it meant Lila wasn't the beginning. And she might not be the only one who never came back. Somewhere in Arizona, in 2001, a van had parked in the dark, a girl had vanished without a sound, and a single fiber, too small to matter, too ordinary to notice, had clung to the truth just long enough to survive. 18 years later, it was finally being heard.
And it was pointing somewhere.
Not loudly, not clearly, but enough to suggest something that hadn't been considered before. That the person responsible hadn't just been lucky. They had been careful, experienced, and very, very good at disappearing. The moment a case stops being random, it becomes dangerous in a different way, not just for the person who did it, but for everyone who realizes they might have been standing closer to the pattern than they ever understood, breathing the same air, passing the same vehicles, living inside a timeline that had already been marked long before anyone noticed the signs. The white van stopped being just a detail. It became the center. Investigators didn't chase it the way they would have in 2001. Broadcast alerts, public appeals, sketches that relied on fading memory. That approach had already failed once. This time, they worked backward, quiet, precise, building a framework before attaching a face to it. Arizona vehicle records from 2001 weren't clean. Paper trails. Partial digitization. Registrations that had lapsed, changed hands, disappeared. Thousands of white vans existed within a 50-mile radius of Phoenix at the time Lila Mercer vanished. Too many, unless you started removing the obvious. Commercial fleets with clear branding, eliminated. Large companies with trackable routes, eliminated. Vehicles tied to known employees working verified shifts that night, eliminated. What remained was smaller. Private owners. Independent contractors. Vehicles that didn't leave clean records, didn't answer to structured oversight. Ghosts in the system. Then they layered in the fiber. Industrial-grade polyester blend. Not common upholstery. Used in specific applications, protective linings, transport coverings, certain types of equipment storage. Often found in vans modified for work rather than personal use. Now the pool narrowed further. White vans, privately owned or loosely registered, modified interiors, access to industrial materials. Still dozens. Still too many to accuse. But not too many to study. They started building profiles, not of people, not yet, but of behaviors. Who worked late. Who operated alone. Who had irregular routes, irregular hours, irregular reasons to be near that grocery store on a Sunday night in June. Patterns began to flicker. One name surfaced early, then slipped away just as quickly, not because it didn't fit, but because it fit too broadly. A contractor. Mid-30s in 2001. Did maintenance work across multiple commercial properties, including, briefly, the grocery store where Lila worked. Access. Familiarity. A reason to be there without raising suspicion. But no record placing him there that night. No witnesses. No direct link. He went into the file, marked, but not pursued aggressively. Not yet. Because another thread had started to pull tighter. The drainage ditch. The receipt found at 11:03 p.m., originally treated as peripheral, possibly unrelated, was re-examined under the new framework. Location mattered now. Distance mattered. Timing mattered. Less than a mile from the store. Walkable. Drivable in under 2 minutes. If Lila had been taken in her own car, even briefly, why was there nothing else recovered along that path? No additional traces, no discarded items, no evidence of struggle or transport. Unless her car wasn't the primary vehicle. Unless it was only used as a transition point. A controlled space. Temporary. The van returned to the forefront. Because a van didn't need to be close when she exited the store. It only needed to be close after. Investigators reconstructed the parking lot again, digitally this time, using archived layouts, satellite images, old maintenance records. They mapped sightlines, lighting conditions, blind spots created by dumpsters, fencing, the angle of security cameras that in 2001 had been too low resolution to matter. There it was. A gap. A narrow corridor along the side access road where the van had been seen, out of direct camera view, partially shielded, close enough to the main lot to observe, far enough to avoid attention. If someone had approached Lila there, on foot, quickly, with intent, it could have been done in seconds. But that didn't explain the fibers in her car. Unless she had been forced back into it. Moved. Repositioned. Then transferred. The sequence began to take shape, not as certainty, but as probability layered over probability until it started to feel like memory. She exits the store. Walks to her car. Unlocks the door. Someone approaches. Fast, controlled, prepared. Gloves. No fingerprints. She's subdued. Not necessarily violently, not loudly, but effectively. Inside the car. Contained. Out of sight for just long enough. Then moved again. Out of her car. Into the van. The fibers. The impression in the rear seat. The absence of noise. It all aligned. Too well. Which meant one thing investigators had been reluctant to say out loud in 2001, but could no longer avoid now. This was planned. Not impulsive. Not random. Someone had chosen that location, that time, that method. And if they had chosen it once, they might have chosen it before. Or after. The search expanded beyond Phoenix. Cold case databases were cross-referenced, missing persons, unsolved abductions, incidents with similar characteristics, Late-night disappearances, minimal evidence, proximity to commercial areas, potential involvement of utility vehicles. At first, nothing exact. Then near matches. Nevada, 1999. A 19-year-old vanished after leaving a convenience store. Car found unlocked. No signs of struggle. New Mexico, 2003. A woman disappeared from a parking lot outside a late-night diner. Witness mentioned a work van nearby but couldn't describe it. Colorado, 2004. Attempted abduction. Interrupted. Victim escaped. Reported being approached by a man wearing gloves. Vehicle described as white, maybe a van. Individually, they were weak. Collectively, they formed a pattern that refused to be ignored. Not identical, but similar enough. The geography traced a loose arc across the Southwest, states connected by highways, by transport routes, by the kind of work that required movement, independence, anonymity. Someone who didn't stay in one place. Someone who didn't need to. The contractor's name resurfaced. This time, it didn't slip away. Employment records showed travel. Jobs across state lines. Contracts that placed him in Nevada in 1999. Arizona in 2001. New Mexico in early 2003. Nothing criminal. Nothing flagged at the time. Just movement. Consistent. Unremarkable. Exactly the kind that disappears in plain sight. Investigators pulled deeper. Vehicle registration. White cargo van. Purchased used in 1998. Sold in 2005. No record of its current status. Interior modifications? No official documentation. But a former coworker, interviewed years later, remembered something small, almost irrelevant. He kept the back different, lined it with something, said it was for hauling equipment without scratching it. Lined it? With what? The answer wasn't documented, but the fiber was. Industrial-grade polyester blend. Dark blue. Suddenly, the gap between speculation and evidence narrowed to something that felt dangerously close to a bridge. But it still wasn't enough. No DNA. No direct witness placing him with Lila. No physical evidence tying him to her car, her home, her last known movements. Just convergence. Circumstantial. Compelling, but not prosecutable. And yet, the more they looked, the more the silence around him began to feel constructed. Neighbors from that time remembered him as quiet, kept to himself, worked odd hours. Nothing unusual until they were asked specific questions. Did he ever have visitors late at night? Long pause. Maybe. Did he ever clean his van excessively? Another pause. I mean, yeah, but he worked with tools. That's normal, right? Normal. Everything about him was normal, which in cases like this often meant one thing. He knew how to be. The investigation tightened, but carefully. No arrests. No public statements. The case remained officially under review. The breakthrough kept contained within a small circle of detectives who understood how fragile it still was. Because if they were right, if the pattern held, if the fibers matched, if the timeline aligned, then they weren't just reopening a cold case. They were circling someone who had spent nearly 2 decades unchallenged. Someone who had lived a life, built routines, blended into communities that had no idea what might have been hidden just beneath the surface. And people like that don't panic easily. They adapt. They adjust. They disappear. Unless you move faster than they do. Unless you find something they didn't know they left behind. Because the fiber was just the beginning. A thread. And threads, if pulled carefully, don't just reveal what's attached to them. They unravel everything. By the time investigators said his name out loud in the same room as Lila Mercer's file, it no longer felt like speculation. It felt like risk, the kind that builds slowly, almost invisibly, until someone realizes they are no longer studying a possibility, but approaching a person who has already proven he can erase moments, silence evidence, and walk away without leaving enough behind to be stopped. His name was Daniel Harker. In 2001, he was 36 years old. Independent contractor. Maintenance and repair jobs scattered across Arizona and neighboring states. No criminal record. No arrests. No complaints that escalated beyond minor disputes, noise, parking, Things that dissolve into nothing when stacked against the weight of a missing person case. Which is exactly why he had never been noticed. He didn't stand out in the system.
He existed just outside it.
But now, every detail that once seemed ordinary began to sharpen under pressure. His work orders, fragmented, incomplete, placed him within a 3-mile radius of the grocery store multiple times in the months leading up to June 2001. Not consistently enough to form a pattern anyone would have flagged at the time. Just enough to suggest familiarity.
He knew the area.
He knew the layout. He knew where the cameras were, and more importantly, where they weren't. The white van, registered under his name in 1998, sold in 2005 to a buyer who couldn't be traced, cash transaction, minimal paperwork, a gap that would have been insignificant if anyone had been looking back then. Now it felt deliberate. Investigators located photographs, old insurance records, a traffic citation image from 2002. Grainy, but usable. The van matched the general description. White cargo body, no external markings, slight dent along the rear panel. Nothing definitive. Everything consistent. The next step wasn't confrontation. It was confirmation. They needed something physical. Something that bridged the gap between probability and proof. Because without that, Daniel Harker remained exactly what he had always been. Another name in a file, another theory that couldn't hold under scrutiny. Surveillance began quietly.
He was older now.
Mid-50s. Still working, though less frequently. Still living alone. Still driving, though not the same van. A different vehicle. Cleaner. Unremarkable. Just like him. They watched his routines. Morning departures. Late returns. Erratic schedules that hadn't changed much in 2 decades. He moved like someone who had never needed to explain himself to anyone. No visible panic. No sudden changes in behavior. If he knew anything about the reopened case, he didn't show it. Which made sense. Because officially, there was nothing to know. The case hadn't gone public again. No headlines. No announcements. Just a quiet shift behind closed doors. But people like Harker, if he was what they were beginning to suspect, didn't rely on news to feel pressure. They relied on instinct. And instinct doesn't always wait for confirmation. So investigators moved carefully. Trash pulls. Legal. Low profile. Often effective. They collected what he discarded, food containers, packaging, anything that might carry DNA. Not because they had DNA from Lila Mercer to compare against, they didn't, but because they needed a baseline. Something that could be matched if new evidence surfaced. And that was the problem.
They still didn't have enough.
The fiber connected to a type of material, not a specific source. The van was gone. The timeline aligned, but alignment isn't guilt. They were close. Painfully close. But still outside the line that mattered. Then something shifted. Not in the lab. Not in the evidence. In memory. A retired officer, one of the original responders in 2001, came forward after hearing, indirectly, that the case had been revisited. He didn't have new evidence. He didn't have a suspect. What he had was doubt. A detail he had dismissed at the time, because it didn't fit. And details that don't fit often get pushed aside, especially when everything else already feels overwhelming. He remembered a call. Not logged as significant. Just a follow-up interview with a local resident who lived along the side access road, the same road where the van had been seen. The resident had reported hearing something that night. Not a scream. Not a struggle. Something mechanical. A sliding sound. Then a dull thud. At the time, it was written off.
Could have been anything.
Dumpster lid.
Car door.
Environmental noise that becomes suspicious only after something bad happens nearby. But now, paired with the van, with the theory of a contained space, with the possibility that Lila had been moved from one vehicle to another, it took on a different shape.
A front door.
Sliding open. Sliding shut. The thud. Weight being shifted. The timeline tightened again. Investigators revisited the location physically, standing where that resident had once stood, reconstructing not just the layout but the acoustics, distance, angles, the way sound carried, or didn't, through the still desert air at night. It was possible. More than possible. It was consistent, and consistency, layered over time, begins to feel like truth. They went back to Harker's work history again, this time focusing not just on where he had been but what he had been doing. One job stood out. June 2001. A short-term maintenance contract at a storage facility less than 2 miles from the grocery store. Duration, 3 days. End date, June 16th. The night before Lila disappeared. He had access.
To space.
To privacy. To somewhere off-grid enough that no one would question unusual activity, late-night visits, a vehicle entering or leaving at odd hours. Storage units don't ask questions. They don't keep detailed logs. In 2001, most didn't even have cameras. Investigators tracked the facility. Ownership had changed twice since then. Records were incomplete, fragmented, partially lost. But one thing remained. A map. Unit layouts from that period. Harker had been assigned maintenance work near a specific row. Units that backed against a perimeter wall, isolated from the main office, shielded from the road. A dead zone. They couldn't prove he had rented a unit. No records survived. But they couldn't prove he hadn't. And that uncertainty, paired with everything else, began to feel less like a gap and more like a shadow shaped exactly like the answer they were chasing. Still, it wasn't enough. Not yet. Then the lab called. Not with a miracle. With a complication. The additional fibers recovered from Lila's car, the ones found during the reprocessing, had yielded something unexpected.
Not DNA.
Not a direct identifier. A contaminant. Microscopic. Embedded within the fibers themselves. Metallic residue. Trace elements consistent with industrial sealants. The kind used in vehicle modifications. Interior lining installations. The kind someone like Daniel Harker might have used. Or anyone in his line of work. Again close. Again not enough. But the margin was shrinking. Every new detail didn't just add to the case. It removed alternatives, stripped away coincidence, reduced the number of explanations that could survive all these intersections. At some point, coincidence stops being plausible. At some point, patterns demand accountability. Investigators stood at that edge now, looking at a man who had never been charged, never been questioned in connection to Lila Mercer, never appeared in any official report tied to her disappearance. And yet, piece by piece, his world was beginning to overlap with hers in ways that couldn't be ignored. The van, the fibers, the timing, the location, the access, the silence. All of it pointed in one direction. But direction isn't destination. And until they could cross that final distance, until they could place him, undeniably, inside the moment where Lila Mercer vanished, he remained untouchable. A figure in the periphery. A shadow that matched the outline of the truth, but refused to step fully into the light. And shadows, when they realize they're being watched, don't always stay still. Sometimes, they move. The first real crack didn't come from pressure. It didn't come from surveillance tightening or evidence suddenly transforming into certainty. It came from time, slow, patient, relentless time. The one force that changes everything, including people who once believed they had outrun what they did. Daniel Harker had lived 18 years untouched. That kind of distance creates confidence. Routine hardens. Caution softens, not completely, not recklessly, but just enough. Just enough for something small to slip. And small was all the investigators needed. It started with a habit. Every Thursday morning, just after sunrise, Harker drove 20 minutes outside the city to a salvage yard, one of those sprawling places where vehicles went to disappear piece by piece, stripped, sorted, reduced to metal and memory. He didn't work there, didn't have a formal contract. He just showed up. Regular. Predictable. He would walk the rows slowly, deliberately, as if he were looking for something specific, but never seemed to by anything significant. Sometimes a tool. Sometimes nothing at all. It didn't look suspicious. It looked familiar. Like someone revisiting something only they could see. Investigators logged it, watched it repeat, week after week, same time, same pattern. Then they noticed where he spent the most time. Not random rows. Not high-value vehicles. Old vans. Cargo models from the late 90s to early 2000s.
White.
Unmarked. The kind that blended into traffic without leaving an impression. The kind witnesses forget. It could have meant nothing. Nostalgia. Professional interest. Habit.
Or
recognition. A forensic team was brought in undercover, posing as inventory auditors, documenting vehicle remnants, cataloging materials. They weren't looking for a specific van. That one was long gone, if it even still existed. They were looking for something else. Patterns. Modifications. The way interiors had been altered, lining materials, sealants, structural adjustments that might match what they had seen in Lila's case. And they found them. Not one-to-one matches. Not exact replicas. But similarities. Industrial polyester lining installed along interior panels, not standard, not factory issued. Done manually. Reinforced in certain areas. Secured with sealant consistent with the trace residue found in Lila's car. It was a method. Not unique enough to identify a single individual, but specific enough to suggest experience. Someone who had done it more than once. The team cross-referenced known contractors who performed that kind of work in the early 2000s, vehicle modification for transport, tool storage, equipment protection. The list overlapped. Names repeated. Daniel Harker was one of them. Again, always there. Never alone, but never absent. That's when investigators changed strategy. They stopped trying to prove he had taken Lila Mercer. Instead, they tried to prove something smaller. Something simpler. That he had owned a van modified in that specific way. Because if they could establish that, firmly, undeniably, it would collapse distance between him and the fiber, between him and the method, between him and the moment that had remained just out of reach for nearly 2 decades. They tracked down former clients. Old job sites. Anyone who might remember his work, not the details of a single job, but the habits, the signatures, the way he did things differently from others. Most remembered nothing. Time erases edges first. But one did. A man who had hired Harker in 2000 for a private job, retrofitting a cargo van for equipment transport. He didn't remember dates exactly. Didn't remember specifications in technical terms. But he remembered one thing clearly. The lining, he said. Dark blue. He said it was tougher than the usual stuff. Wouldn't tear. Wouldn't stain. Dark blue. The same color noted in the evidence file. The same fiber pulled from Lila's car. It still wasn't proof. But it wasn't coincidence anymore. It was convergence tightening into something harder to dismiss. Investigators returned to the lab, re-examined the fibers with updated comparison models, not just identifying the material, but tracing manufacturing distributions. Where had that specific blend been sold?
Who had access to it?
Which suppliers carried it in Arizona between 1998 and 2001? The answer narrowed again. A handful of distributors. Records incomplete, but not gone. One invoice surfaced. Dated late 1999. Bulk purchase of industrial polyester lining. Buyer. Independent contractor. Name partially obscured in the record. Ink degradation, scanning artifacts, but enough remained to match a pattern. Initials, DH. It wasn't a signature. It wasn't a confirmation. But it aligned too cleanly with everything else. The walls were closing, not visibly, not publicly, but structurally, like a framework locking into place around a space that was finally beginning to look like the truth. Still, one piece remained missing. The piece that always matters most. Lila Mercer herself. No remains. No confirmed location. No physical link tying Harker directly to her body because there was no body. And without that, the case hovered in a space that investigators know too well. Almost there, but not enough. That's when the past shifted again. A name surfaced in the cross-state comparisons, one that had been noted before, but never fully explored. Elena Ruiz. New Mexico, 2003. Disappeared after leaving a late-night diner. Vehicle found. No signs of struggle. Witness mentioned a white van. At the time, the case stalled quickly. Fewer resources. Less coverage. It faded faster than Lila's, absorbed into a system already overwhelmed with unsolved disappearances. But now, with the pattern forming, investigators reached out, reopened the file, requested evidence. What came back wasn't much, but it was enough. From Elena Ruiz's vehicle, preserved, archived, nearly forgotten, there were fibers. Collected.
Logged.
Never fully analyzed. Until now. Same composition. Same industrial polyester blend. Same dark blue. The room changed when that result came in, because one case can be coincidence. Two cases, separated by time and state lines, sharing the same rare material, the same method, the same absence of struggle. That becomes something else. That becomes a pattern with weight. And patterns lead to intent. Intent leads to accountability. But only if you can hold it together long enough to make it undeniable. Investigators laid the timelines side by side. 1999, Nevada near match. 2001, Lila Mercer.
2003, Elena Ruiz.
All within reach of Harker's documented work routes. All consistent with the van. The lining. The gloves. The silence. And still, no direct evidence placing him at the scene. No witness who could say, I saw him. No forensic link that crossed the final threshold. Just a tightening net of probability that was beginning to look less like theory and more like something that had been hiding in plain sight for years. And then came the question no one could avoid anymore. If there were two, could there be more? Because patterns don't always stop where you find them. Sometimes they continue, unseen, unreported, misclassified as something else entirely. Missing, runaway, unresolved. The team expanded the search again, not just across states, but across categories, cases that didn't initially look like abductions, cases that had been dismissed too quickly, cases where the details were too thin to raise alarms at the time. And slowly, quietly, more names began to surface. Not all matched. Some fell away under scrutiny, but a few stayed. Close enough. Similar enough. Enough to suggest that what happened to Lila Mercer might not have been an isolated act. It might have been part of something longer. Something practiced. Something refined over time. And if that was true, then Daniel Harker wasn't just a suspect in a cold case. He was something else entirely. Something that had been moving through lives, through cities, through years, without interruption. Until now. Because the difference between getting away with something once and getting away with it repeatedly isn't luck, it's control. And control eventually slips. Not all at once. Not dramatically, but in small ways. Habits, patterns, repetition. The very things that make someone effective also make them traceable. And now, after 18 years of silence, the trace was no longer invisible. It was forming a line. Straight. Unbroken. Leading back to a man who had never once been asked the question that mattered most. Where were you? The night she disappeared? They didn't bring him in right away. Not because they weren't ready, but because they were close enough to know that one wrong move could fracture everything they had spent months rebuilding from fragments. Daniel Harker had lived too long without pressure. Drop it on him too suddenly, too directly, and he might do what careful people always do when cornered. He would retreat. Shut down. Ask for a lawyer. And the case, still balancing on inference, alignment, and emerging forensic links, would stall again, this time with a suspect fully aware he was being watched. So they did something else. They waited. And while they waited, they kept pulling. Because the fiber had opened the door, the van had framed the method, and Elena Ruiz had confirmed the pattern, but patterns still needed anchors, fixed points in reality that could survive in a courtroom, not just in theory. That anchor came from somewhere no one expected. Not from Lila's case. Not from Arizona. But from Colorado. The attempted abduction that had once been filed, investigated briefly, then downgraded when the victim survived and couldn't provide enough detail to identify her attacker. It had always been treated as an isolated incident, disturbing but incomplete. Now it was something else. Now it was a survivor. And survivors remember differently. Not always clearly. Not always consistently. But when time passes and context changes, memory can reorganize itself, reshaping fragments into something sharper. Investigators reached out. She agreed to talk. At first, her account matched the original report. Late night, parking lot, a man approaching too quickly, too close. A vehicle nearby. She couldn't see his face clearly. He wore gloves. That detail had always stood out even back then. But this time, they didn't ask the same questions. They asked better ones. What did the vehicle look like? Not just color, not just type, but inside. What did it feel like when the door opened? What did she smell? She paused there. Longer than before. Because no one had asked her that in 2004. The smell. She described it slowly, uncertain at first, then with growing clarity. Chemical. Not strong, but artificial. Like plastic. Or like something new, even though it wasn't. That alone could have meant anything. Until she added one more detail. There was fabric inside. Not like seats. On the walls. Dark. I remember touching it when I pushed away. Dark fabric. Lining. Inside a van. The room went still when she said it. Because now, for the first time, they had something that crossed the line from pattern to experience. From theory to lived moment. Someone had been inside that space. And lived to describe it. They showed her images. Not of Harker directly, not yet, but of similar vans, interiors modified in different ways. She pointed. Not with certainty. Not with full confidence. But enough. Enough to narrow the field to something that looked dangerously familiar. Then they showed her a photograph. Daniel Harker. Age progressed. Neutral expression. No context. Just a face. She stared at it. Too long for it to mean nothing. Then she said the words investigators had been waiting nearly 2 decades to hear. I don't know if it's him, but it feels like him. Not admissible. Not definitive. But powerful. Because recognition doesn't always come from memory alone. Sometimes it comes from something deeper. Pattern recognition, instinct, the brain connecting pieces it doesn't fully understand but refuses to ignore. And now, the case had something it never had before. A living thread. One that didn't end in disappearance. One that pointed back. Directly. Toward a man who had spent years existing just outside the edges of suspicion. That changed everything. Because now they could move. Not recklessly. Not without structure. But with enough to justify the next step. They brought him in. Voluntarily. No cuffs. No accusations. Just a conversation. Daniel Harker walked into the interview room like someone who had done nothing wrong, or like someone who had practiced appearing that way for so long it had become indistinguishable from truth. He sat down. Calm. Measured. Curious. But not alarmed. Something I can help you with? The detective across from him didn't answer immediately. Silence is a tool. Used correctly, it forces people to fill it. Harker didn't. He waited. So they began. Routine questions. Work history. Travel. Old contracts. Places he had been in the early 2000s. He answered easily. No hesitation. No visible strain. If he was lying, he had done it before. If he was telling the truth, it sounded exactly the same. They shifted. June 2001. Phoenix. The grocery store. He paused. Just slightly. Not enough to register as panic. But enough. I worked all over that area, he said. Hard to remember specific days. Reasonable. Expected. Not helpful. They pressed further. Did you own a white cargo van? Yes. Did you modify the interior? For work. Tools. Equipment. What kind of materials did you use? He shrugged. Whatever was durable. Whatever got the job done. Generic. Non-committal. Careful. They introduced the fiber. Not as evidence tied to him. Just as a question. Have you ever used industrial polyester lining? Another pause. Shorter this time. Maybe. Sounds familiar. Then they said her name. Lila Mercer. For the first time, something changed. Not dramatically. Not visibly to anyone untrained. But it was there. A flicker. Recognition? Or calculation? Doesn't ring a bell, he said. Too quickly. Too clean. They let it sit. Then they added another name. Elena Ruiz. Nothing. Or better controlled. Then the survivor. Colorado. 2004. They didn't give details. Just the event. This time he leaned back. A shift in posture. Distance. I don't know anything about that, he said. And for the first time, there was something under the words. Not fear. Not yet. But awareness. Because now, the questions weren't random. They were connected. And he could feel it. They didn't accuse him. They didn't push. Not yet. Because this wasn't about breaking him in one session. This was about mapping him. Watching how he moved when certain details entered the room. Where he resisted. Where he deflected. Where he stayed too neutral. After 2 hours, they let him go. No charges. No confrontation. Just a conversation that ended the way it began. Quietly. But something had shifted. Because now he knew. Not everything. Not how much they had. But enough to understand that the past, the part he had left behind, buried somewhere between states, between jobs, between years, was no longer still. It was moving again. And people like Daniel Harker don't wait to see what happens next. They act. Subtly. Carefully. But they act. Surveillance picked it up within days. Changes. Small at first. Routes altered. Stops skipped. The Thursday visits to the salvage yard, missed for the first time in months. Then resumed. Then missed again. Not random. Reactive. He was adjusting. Which meant one thing. He felt pressure. And pressure creates mistakes. Not always big ones. Not obvious ones. But enough. Enough for someone watching closely. And they were watching. Every movement. Every deviation. Because now it wasn't just about proving what he had done in 2001. It was about catching what he might do next. Because if the pattern was real, if Lila Mercer wasn't the only one, if Elena Ruiz wasn't the last, then the most dangerous thing about Daniel Harker wasn't what he had already done. It was what he might still be capable of doing. And for the first time in 18 years, that possibility wasn't theoretical. It was immediate. Close. Breathing the same air. Driving the same roads. Waiting for something no one else could see yet. But something investigators were beginning to understand with growing clarity. The pattern hadn't just existed in the past. It had been paused. And now, it might be starting again. The shift was subtle at first, so small it could have been dismissed as coincidence if anyone had been looking less closely, but patterns don't disappear, they mutate. And what investigators began to see in Daniel Harker's movements wasn't randomness, it was recalibration, the quiet, controlled kind that only happens when someone realizes the environment around them has changed. He wasn't running. That would have been easier. He wasn't panicking. That would have been visible. He was adjusting. Routes altered by minutes, not hours. Stops replaced, not eliminated. Familiar places revisited, but at different times, under different conditions, like someone testing whether the world still behaved the way it used to. And most telling of all, he started watching. Not in any obvious way. Not turning his head, not scanning dramatically. But in reflections. Store windows. Rearview mirrors. The subtle, almost invisible checks that trained observers recognize instantly. He knew. Not everything. But enough. Surveillance tightened. Unmarked vehicles rotated. Foot teams cycled in shorter intervals. Digital tracking, limited but precise, filled the gaps where physical presence couldn't reach. They weren't just observing him anymore. They were anticipating him. Because if he felt pressure, he would either retreat completely, or he would act. And history suggested he didn't retreat. The break came on a Tuesday. Not Thursday, the day he usually visited the salvage yard. Tuesday. Mid-afternoon. Unscheduled. Unexpected. He drove out of the city, taking a route he hadn't used in weeks, heading toward a stretch of industrial outskirts where development had stalled years earlier, leaving behind empty lots, half-built structures, and storage facilities that operated just outside the rhythm of normal oversight. The same kind of environment he had been in before. The same kind of environment where things could happen without witnesses. Investigators followed at a distance. No lights. No sirens. Just presence. He pulled into a storage facility, different from the one in 2001 but similar in layout. Rows of units, minimal staff, no active security visible from the outside.
He parked. Didn't get out immediately. Sat there.
Engine running. 5 minutes.
10.
15. Then he stepped out.
Calm.
Deliberate. Walked to a unit near the back row. Unlocked it. Slid the door open. That sound. Metal on track. A detail that had lived for years in a dismissed witness statement. Now real. Now present. Now happening again. Investigators didn't move in. Not yet. They watched. Recorded. Timed everything. He disappeared inside for less than 4 minutes. Then came back out. Locked the unit. Drove away. No visible cargo. No obvious purpose. But something about the timing felt wrong. Too short to retrieve tools. Too short to store equipment. Just long enough
to check something.
Or to make sure something was still there. They waited until he was gone. Then they moved. Legal process had already been prepared for this possibility. Fast-tracked warrants, conditional approvals based on observed behavior combined with the existing cold case evidence. It wasn't enough for an arrest, but it was enough to look. The unit was opened, and at first glance, it looked empty. No tools. No equipment. No stored belongings. Just space. Concrete floor. Bare walls.
Dust.
Nothing. Except not nothing. Because when you know what you're looking for, absence becomes a clue. The walls. Too clean. Not recently cleaned, but uniformly worn in a way that didn't match the rest of the facility. Subtle differences in texture, in coloration, like something had been there once.
And removed.
Investigators moved slowly, carefully, every inch documented, every surface tested. And then they found it, not in plain sight, not even hidden well, just overlooked. A fragment, caught in the seam where the wall met the floor. Tiny, almost invisible, but unmistakable. Fiber, dark blue, the same kind, the same composition, the same silent thread that had pulled this entire case back into motion. But this time, it wasn't from 2001. This was recent. Fresh enough to retain structure. Fresh enough to suggest something had been here. Recently, the room shifted. Because now the timeline wasn't confined to the past anymore. Now it extended forward. Into the present. Into a space that Daniel Harker still had access to. Still used. Still returned to. And whatever had been inside that unit was no longer there. Which raised a question more urgent than any they had faced so far. Where did it go? Forensics expanded the search. Floor samples. Trace materials. Microscopic residues embedded in cracks, in edges, in places that don't get cleaned even when everything else does. And slowly, the picture began to form. Not clearly. Not completely. But enough. There had been something in that unit. Something that left behind organic traces. Not enough for immediate identification. But enough to confirm presence. Human. The silence in the room wasn't uncertainty anymore. It was realization. Because this wasn't just a man connected to a cold case from 2001. This was a man actively maintaining a space consistent with that same method. A contained environment. Controlled. Private. Temporary. The same pattern. 18 years later. Still intact. Still in use. The investigation pivoted instantly. No more waiting. No more slow build. Because whatever had been in that unit, whatever had left those traces, it wasn't history.
It was now.
Teams expanded outward from the facility. Recent missing persons reports. Unresolved disappearances within a 50-mile radius. Anything that could fit. And they found one. Not widely reported. Not yet escalated. Just a name in a system that processes hundreds like it every year.
Cara Lynn, 22.
Last seen 4 days earlier. Left work. Never made it home. Car found. Unlocked. No signs of struggle. The details hit like a shockwave. Because they weren't just similar. They were identical. Same pattern. Same silence. Same absence. Except this time, They were watching the man they believed was responsible.
In real time.
The past had caught up. And it hadn't come alone. Because if Carolyn had been in that unit, even briefly, then the clock wasn't measured in years anymore. It was measured in hours. Maybe less. Investigators moved fast. Faster than they had at any point in the case. Search warrants expanded. Digital records pulled. Traffic cameras analyzed. Every movement Harker had made in the last 72 hours reconstructed down to the minute. And one location surfaced. Not the storage unit. Not his home. Somewhere in between. A stretch of land outside the city limits. Undeveloped. Unmonitored. Empty on every map that mattered. But not empty in reality. He had been there.
Twice.
In the last 2 days. For less than 20 minutes each time. Long enough.
To do something. Short enough.
To avoid attention. Teams were deployed immediately. No delay. No hesitation. Because now this wasn't just about solving a cold case. This was about stopping something that might still be unfolding. They reached the site just before sunset. The desert stretched out in all directions, flat, unforgiving, silent in the way only places untouched by people can be. Except it wasn't untouched. Tire tracks.
Fresh.
Leading off the main path. Stopping near shallow depression in the ground. The kind you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. The kind you would miss completely if you didn't already know something was wrong. They approached slowly. Carefully. Every step measured. Because in cases like this, the difference between too late and just in time is almost invisible. And as the first layer of earth began to shift under careful hands, under controlled movement, under the weight of 18 years of unanswered questions pressing down on a single moment, the truth began to surface. Not all at once. Not clearly. But enough to confirm what no one could say out loud yet. This wasn't over. It had never been over. And whatever Daniel Harker had started in 2001 had never really stopped. It had just been waiting. Quiet. Unseen. Until someone finally looked in the right place. And now that they had, there was no going back. Because the ground beneath them wasn't just holding evidence. It was holding time. And time, once uncovered, doesn't stay buried. It tells everything. The first thing they uncovered wasn't a body. It was fabric.
Dark.
Compressed into the soil, partially preserved by the dry heat, partially degraded by time, but unmistakable in texture, in composition, in the way it resisted tearing even after years beneath the surface. Industrial polyester. Dark blue. The same fiber. Again. But this time, it wasn't a transfer. It wasn't a trace left behind by contact. It was part of something larger. Something that had been placed there intentionally. The excavation slowed immediately. Protocol tightened. Every grain of dirt became evidence. Every movement deliberate. Because now, they weren't just following a pattern. They were inside it. The desert gave up its secrets slowly. Layer by layer. Heat rising off the ground as the sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across a scene that had already begun to feel heavier than anything the case had revealed so far. Then came the second find. A personal item.
Small.
Metallic. A pendant. Initials etched faintly into the surface. KL.
Carolyn.
The name landed with a weight that shifted the entire investigation from urgent to critical. Because now, there was no ambiguity left. No room for coincidence. She had been here. And whatever had happened to her had happened recently. The search intensified. Additional teams arrived. Floodlights prepared as daylight began to collapse into night. They weren't stopping.
Not now.
Not when they were this close. Because the difference between recovery and rescue can exist in the same space for only a brief moment, and no one there was willing to assume which side of that line they were standing on. More soil removed. More fragments uncovered. Bindings. Synthetic.
Cut clean.
Not improvised.
Prepared.
Everything about the scene spoke the same language investigators had been translating for months now.
Control.
Precision. Repetition. This wasn't chaos. It was a system. And systems don't change unless something forces them to. Which meant one thing pressed into every mind on that site. If Carolyn had been brought here, then she might not have been here long. Which meant she might have been moved. Again. The realization hit fast. Hard. Because it meant they were already behind. Even with everything they had uncovered. Even with Harker under surveillance. Even with the storage unit, the fibers, the pattern laid out almost perfectly in front of them. He was still ahead. By hours. Maybe less. Search teams split. One remained at the site. The others moved outward, retracing every route Harker had taken in the last 48 hours. Every stop. Every deviation. Every moment where he had disappeared from easy observation. Because somewhere between the storage unit and this patch of desert, there had been another location. Another transition point. Another place where Carolyn might still be alive. Harker was brought in again. This time, it wasn't voluntary. No calm conversation. No neutral tone. He was detained. Placed in an interview room that felt smaller than before, not because the space had changed, but because the stakes had. He knew. The moment he sat down, he knew this wasn't the same conversation. Something had shifted. And for the first time, the control he had maintained so carefully began to fracture. Not visibly. Not completely. But enough. You've been busy, the detective said, placing the pendant on the table. No explanation. No build-up. Just the object. Reality. Reduced to metal and memory. Harker looked at it. Just long enough. Then leaned back. I don't know what that is. The denial came fast. Too fast. Automatic. But something underneath it had changed. The rhythm. The breathing. The stillness that had defined him before was gone. Replaced by calculation under pressure. They didn't argue. Didn't push immediately. They let the silence expand. Let the weight of what had been found settle into the room. Then they started laying it out. The storage unit. The fibers. The excavation site. Not everything. Just enough. Enough to make it clear that this wasn't speculation anymore. This was trajectory. And it was closing in. Harker didn't break. Not in the way people expect. No sudden confession. No collapse. He stayed controlled. But control isn't the same as stability. And under the surface, something was shifting. Because now, for the first time in 18 years, he wasn't invisible anymore. The investigation outside the room moved faster than the one inside. Traffic cameras. License plate readers. Fuel purchases. Every digital footprint from the last 72 hours pulled and mapped. And there it was. A gap. Not large. Not obvious. But real. A stretch of 43 minutes where Harker's vehicle disappeared from all known camera coverage. Between the desert site and his return to the city. 43 minutes. Enough time to move someone. Enough time to relocate. Enough time to hide something that wasn't meant to be found quickly. Investigators isolated the zone. Mapped the possible routes. Reduced them based on terrain, accessibility, and Harker's known patterns. 3 locations remained. All within a 10-mile radius. All remote. All quiet. Search teams deployed again. Night fully set in now. Floodlights cutting through darkness. Engines low. Voices minimal. Every second mattered. Because if Carolyn was still alive, she was running out of time. Back in the interview room, the tone shifted. No more slow build. No more indirect pressure. They pushed. Hard. We know she was in that unit. Silence. We know you moved her. Nothing. We know where you took her. That got a reaction. Small. But real. A flicker of something that hadn't been there before. Not denial. Not confusion. Recognition. Because that's the moment the balance changes. When a suspect stops wondering what you know, and starts wondering how much more you're about to say. Harker leaned forward slightly. Hands clasped. Eyes fixed on the table. Not on the detectives. Not on the evidence. Somewhere in between. Like he was measuring something internal. Time. Risk. Options. But options were closing. Fast. Because outside that room, search teams were already moving toward the first location. An abandoned structure. Half collapsed. Long forgotten. They cleared it. Nothing. Second location. Dry riverbed. Fresh tire tracks. Search widened. Still nothing. Which left one. The furthest. The hardest to access. A stretch of land broken by uneven terrain, scattered debris, and structures that barely qualified as buildings anymore. The kind of place no one goes unless they have a reason, or something to hide. The team moved in. Careful. Fast. Controlled. Flashlights cutting across jagged edges and deep shadows. Listening. Because sometimes, before you see something, you hear it.
A sound. Faint.
Irregular. Not mechanical. Not environmental. Human. They froze. Focused. Listened again.
There.
Again.
Weak.
But real. They followed it. Through debris. Through narrow passages. Into a space that felt wrong the moment they entered it. Too contained. Too quiet. And then, they found her.
Kara Lynn. Alive.
Barely conscious.
Bound.
Hidden in a space that mirrored everything the investigation had been building toward since the first fiber was pulled from Lila Mercer's car.
Contained.
Controlled. Temporary. She was pulled out fast. Medical team already moving. Vitals weak, but present.
Time.
They had reached her in time. Back in the interview room, the shift was immediate. News travels differently in those spaces. Not through words. Through energy. Through the way a door opens. The way someone enters. The way silence changes shape. Harker saw it. Felt it. And for the first time, he understood. Whatever control he had built over 18 years
was gone.
Because the pattern had been broken. The system had failed. And the one variable he had always relied on, silence, had just been replaced by a voice that survived. The moment Kara Lynn took her first full breath under hospital lights, the entire case shifted from reconstruction to confrontation, from theory to testimony, from a pattern built on fragments to a narrative that could finally speak back. She didn't say much at first.
Couldn't.
Dehydration.
Shock.
Trauma layered too quickly, too violently over too little time. Her voice came in pieces, disconnected, fragile, like something still deciding whether it was safe to exist again. But even fragments were enough. Because every word she managed to form didn't just describe what happened to her, it illuminated everything that had come before. The room was quiet when detectives entered. No pressure. No urgency in their tone. Because now, time had shifted to their side. They weren't racing against disappearance anymore. They were building a case that had finally found its center. Kara's eyes moved slowly when they spoke to her. Not unfocused, but cautious, like someone relearning what it meant to trust what she was seeing. He had a van, she said, voice barely above a whisper. No surprise there. But hearing it confirmed by someone who had been inside that space, gave it weight no forensic report ever could.
White, she added.
A detail already known. Still, it landed. Because confirmation transforms suspicion into structure. They didn't interrupt. Didn't guide. They let her continue. There was fabric. On the walls. There it was again. Not theory. Not reconstruction. Reality. The door had slid. That sound. The same sound a witness had dismissed 18 years earlier. Now undeniable. Now anchored in two timelines at once. Did you see his face? One detective asked carefully.
Kara hesitated.
Not because she didn't remember. Because she did. And memory in moments like that isn't just recall, it's impact. Yes. The word changed everything. Because Lila Mercer never had that chance. Elena Ruiz never had that chance. But Kara Lynn did. They showed her the photograph. Daniel Harker. No context. No suggestion. Just the image.
She didn't hesitate this time.
That's him.
Clear. Direct.
Unshaken. The room didn't react outwardly. But internally, everything locked into place. Because now, for the first time in 18 years, they had what the case had always lacked. Identification. Not inferred. Not constructed.
Seen.
Recognized. Spoken. And that changed the rules. Back in the interrogation room, Daniel Harker sat in silence that no longer belonged to him. Before, silence had been his control. Now it was pressure. Because somewhere in the building, someone was telling a story he couldn't erase. And he knew it. The detectives didn't rush in. They let the weight settle first. Let him sit with it. Because the moment someone like Harker realizes the narrative is no longer his to manage, that's when cracks widen. That's when control fractures. They entered the room without ceremony. No build-up. No strategy left to conceal. One file placed on the table. Opened. Inside, photographs. Not just evidence. Sequence. The storage unit. The excavation site. The pendant. And finally,
Carolyn, alive.
Looking directly into the camera taken moments after she was found. Not broken. Not erased. Present.
Real.
Unavoidable. Harker looked at the image. And something inside him shifted in a way it hadn't before. Because evidence can be argued. Timelines can be challenged. Fibers can be explained. But a living victim changes the equation completely. She identified you, the detective said. Flat. No emphasis. No emotion. Just fact. Harker leaned back slowly. Not defensive. Not aggressive. Just recalculating. You're making a mistake. The words came out measured. Controlled. But thinner than before. Because now, denial wasn't enough. Not against what they had. Not against what was coming. She described the van. Silence. The lining. Nothing. The door.
A shift. Small.
But real. And she saw your face. That was the moment. Not dramatic. Not explosive. But final in a way that didn't need volume to be understood. Because for the first time since this began, Daniel Harker didn't respond immediately. And in interrogation, hesitation is louder than any answer. Outside the room, the case expanded rapidly. Search warrants multiplied. His home. His vehicles. His past storage units. Every space he had occupied over the last 2 decades was now subject to examination. Because Carolyn had done more than survive. She had unlocked everything. The first breakthrough came from his current residence. Hidden. Not well, but well enough for someone who never expected anyone to look. A compartment. False paneling. Inside items. Personal. Varied. Not random. Jewelry. Accessories. Objects that didn't belong to one person. Didn't belong to him. Each one a question. Each one a possibility. Each one a name that might or might not match a missing person report buried somewhere in a system that hadn't connected the dots yet. The room filled with a different kind of silence. Not uncertainty. Recognition. Because this wasn't just about Lila Mercer anymore. Or Elena Ruiz. Or Carolyn. This was something larger. Something that had existed undetected across years, across states, across lives that had ended without explanation. Until now. Forensics moved fast. Cataloging. Cross-referencing. Matching items to open cases, to closed cases, to names that had been spoken once, then slowly forgotten. And one by one, they began to align. Not all. Not cleanly. But enough. Enough to suggest that the pattern investigators had feared was real. Back in the interrogation room, the pressure finally found its mark. Not in a confession. Not yet. But in something just as important. A break in control. Harker leaned forward. Hands no longer still. Eyes no longer fixed. You don't understand, he said. The first voluntary statement that wasn't a direct denial. The first crack. And once cracks appear, they spread. Then help us understand, the detective replied.
Calm. Steady.
Because now, they weren't chasing him anymore. They had him. And he knew it. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything that had been building for 18 years. Every missed detail. Every overlooked clue. Every life that had passed through his system without leaving enough behind to stop him. Until now. Because the difference between getting away with something and being stopped isn't always what you did. It's whether someone survives long enough to tell the story. And Carolyn had. Which meant the story didn't belong to Daniel Harker anymore. It belonged to the truth. And the truth was finally starting to speak. The interrogation room felt smaller now. Walls closing in, ceiling lower, lights harsher, as if the weight of 18 years of secrets had finally pressed into a tangible space. Daniel Harker sat rigid, fingers drumming lightly, not on the table but in rhythm with the thoughts racing behind his eyes. He had controlled everything for nearly 2 decades, every narrative, every story, every trace. And yet here he was, confronted not with accusation but with truth in motion, the living, breathing evidence of everything he had tried to erase. Investigators didn't rush. They didn't raise voices. The case had matured into a weapon of patience, each question calibrated, each revelation placed deliberately, like chess pieces on a board too vast for him to see in its entirety. "Where did you take her?" one detective asked. The words were soft but impossible to ignore. They didn't demand an answer. They invited one. Harker's eyes flicked up, then down, then back, scanning the room as if seeking an escape, a loophole, a moment to regain the control that had slipped almost imperceptibly. "They wouldn't have followed," he said finally, voice low, measured, trying to dismiss the inevitability building around him. "Nobody could have known. Nobody ever does." "Yes," the detective replied, calm. "Until now." Outside, teams combed through his history with renewed precision. Storage units, abandoned properties, garages, even old job sites were being examined under floodlights. Dust disturbed decades of neglect, uncovering fragments that had long lain dormant. Each discovery fed the puzzle, small fibers, fragments of personal items, hidden compartments, all pointing back to him. Each trace, once meaningless alone, now converged into a pattern so undeniable it left no room for speculation. Harker shifted in his seat again. He hadn't panicked yet. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't cried. But control had fractured, imperceptibly. His mind raced, counting windows, evaluating surveillance, recalculating risk. Everything he had relied upon, predictability, routine, the slow erosion of memory over time, was failing. And somewhere deep inside, he knew it. The same truth investigators had been building brick by brick year after year had finally become visible. The conversation escalated carefully, strategically. They didn't throw evidence at him all at once. They layered it, each piece reinforcing the last. The fibers from Lila Mercer, the pendant from Carolyn, the dark polyester lining, the storage unit traces, the witness identifications. Every single detail was part of a relentless march toward inevitability. Each acknowledgement, each hesitance, each micro-expression was recorded, observed, and stored. Then the breakthrough came. A slip. Imperceptible to anyone untrained, but glaring to those who had studied him for months. A subtle tightening of the jaw. A blink too long. Hands pressed against the table slightly harder than before. Small gestures, tiny betrayals of the mind wrestling against the weight of evidence it could no longer deny. "Tell us the truth," the detective said simply. No flourish. No accusation. Just fact. The room became a pressure chamber. Silence wrapped around the walls like steel. Harker leaned back, exhaling slowly. His voice emerged, low, deliberate, and yet tinged with the faintest crack of human strain. It was supposed to be temporary. "I didn't," he trailed off. The hesitation was monumental. A pause that stretched longer than any denial, longer than any alibi, longer than any fabricated memory. Outside, forensic teams had begun linking the new discoveries to cold cases across multiple states. Elena Ruiz, Lila Mercer, Carolyn. Others, names buried in databases, in dusty folders, in files never fully cross-referenced. Each one aligned with the method, the materials, the timing. The web that had lain dormant for decades now had direction, shape, purpose. It was no longer theory. It was living, sprawling, undeniable. Harker's breathing changed imperceptibly, a shallow rhythm replacing the deep control that had defined him for years. He realized it before anyone else could articulate it. The chain of evidence, the timing, the surveillance, the witnesses, the living survivor, it all converged. The pattern had trapped him. Not legally yet, not with finality, but psychologically, operationally, irrevocably. "You can't undo this," the detective said, almost conversationally. "Not anymore. Every move you made, every place you went, every person you affected, we've traced it. We're not guessing. We're proving. Step by step. Minute by minute. Fiber by fiber." Harker swallowed. He was calculating. Always calculating. But even a master strategist falters when faced with convergence, with inevitability. He didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. His mind raced, running contingency plans, recalling old routes, old storage units, old methods, but none of it mattered anymore. They had seen patterns, aligned timelines, captured deviations, and recovered what he had thought lost forever. And then came the final shift, the one no one can plan for. Acknowledgement. Not full confession, not yet. But the first admission that his control had slipped, that his pattern was visible, that the web investigators had painstakingly reconstructed now included him fully. Small words.
Few.
But monumental in impact. They didn't have to find her. I thought. The room held still. The weight of 18 years, decades of silence and evasion, pressed down. Every detail investigators had built, every subtle clue, every witness, every piece of evidence, now converged in the space of that moment. Harker's silence after that admission spoke louder than words ever could. The human mind recognizes inevitability faster than logic allows. He knew, in that moment, that the pattern was broken, the cycle disrupted, and that 18 years of shadows and avoidance were collapsing around him. And somewhere, outside the room, lights flickered over the desert, over storage yards, over abandoned structures, over spaces once invisible to the law. The pattern was being mapped, the web reconstructed, and the man who had moved through decades without accountability had finally entered the frame that no one could escape. Every fiber, every trace, every life intersected now in one place, and it was only a matter of time before all those threads tied together. No theory, no speculation, no remaining doubt. The past had caught up. The present demanded reckoning. And for the first time, Daniel Harker understood that control was no longer his. Because the difference between evasion and justice isn't always what is done. It's whether someone survives long enough and watches closely enough to ensure that the story is told. And this story had just begun to speak in a voice too clear to ignore. The room was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that masks tension, but the kind that presses down, heavy, oppressive, as if every second stretched into years. Daniel Harker sat there, hands on the table, eyes scanning everything except the truth that had already been laid bare before him. Outside, the world moved fast, helicopters tracing the desert perimeter, unmarked cars following every potential route, forensic teams dissecting every inch of his past and present. But inside, time slowed. Because now, the pattern, the method, the web of years, all converged in a single, immutable point. Him. He had lived in shadows. Invisible, careful, meticulous. But shadows vanish when the light is trained long and steady enough, and investigators had brought the floodlights, inside and out, to expose every inch of control he had cultivated. Cara Lynn had survived. Her voice, her identification, her presence shattered the careful balance he had maintained. She wasn't silent. She hadn't disappeared into the archive of the lost and the missing. She was real.
Alive.
And she remembered. Harker's mind raced, running through contingencies, escape routes, excuses, and rationalizations. But with every passing moment, he realized those options were shrinking. He was trapped in a net of his own making. Surveillance, recovered evidence, witness testimony, and the patterns traced across years converged like threads tightening around him. Each thread precise, unavoidable, undeniable. The detective spoke calmly, deliberately, layering the evidence, letting the weight of facts accumulate. Fibers from Lila Mercer, the pendant from Cara Lynn, traces from storage units, the fragments in the desert, all of it aligned. Each discovery was more than proof. It was a mirror reflecting every moment he had attempted to erase, every action he thought untraceable, every life that had intersected with his silent system of control. For the first time, Harker's control faltered. Not visibly, not dramatically, but in the microseconds between breath and blink, between thought and word. His carefully maintained calm wavered as recognition set in. The pattern had been reconstructed. Every action, every movement, every choice he had believed secret now existed in the eyes, ears, and minds of those who had watched, waited, and connected the dots over nearly 2 decades. They found her, one detective said, flatly, almost as an observation rather than a statement. Cara Lynn, alive, recovered, identifiable. Her presence alone reshaped the narrative from cold case to immediate crisis averted. Harker leaned back, calculating, always calculating, but the calculations yielded no escape. Every past evasion, every manipulation, every silent violation now converged in a frame too small to maneuver in. His lips moved, forming words that were measured but meaningless. You can't prove it. A pause. A micro-expression, a twitch, a subtle tightening of the jaw, betraying thought and panic suppressed beneath years of disciplined composure. But the words themselves lacked the power they once carried. Proof was no longer the problem, survival was. And survival relied on control he no longer possessed. Outside, teams continued to sweep every possible location, guided by the reconstructed timeline, the newly uncovered evidence, the mapping of his movements. Storage units, abandoned buildings, desert lots, old job sites, each yielded fragments that reinforced the emerging narrative. Cara Lynn's testimony alone had transformed speculation into a living map, a real-time reconstruction of Harker's system. Other missing persons, long cold, were now being cross-referenced, each possibility weighted, prioritized, and pursued with precision. Harker's gaze shifted to the images on the table, photos of Cara, of the storage units, the fibers, the pendant. He looked at the faces of investigators, calm, deliberate, methodical. He realized, in a quiet, undeniable moment, that for the first time in nearly 20 years, the network of control he had built, careful, deliberate, invisible, was no longer his. Every avenue of evasion had been illuminated, every shadow mapped, every timeline reconstructed. And then came the admission. Not full, not a confession, but the first crack in the edifice of control he had maintained. They shouldn't have found her, he murmured, voice low, almost to himself. The detectives let it stand. No interruption. No hurry. Silence is often louder than accusation. The walls of the room carried it, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths, and in that space, Harker understood. The cycle that had begun in 2001 was over, or at least broken. Outside, the desert settled into night. The lights of the investigation, bright and unyielding, reflected off sand, metal, and dust, tracing paths Harker had once believed private. Each flicker of illumination was a reminder. The pattern he had relied upon, perfected over years, was now fully visible, fully mapped, fully constrained. Control had shifted from predator to observer. Time had caught up. The silence of years had been replaced by witness, evidence, and survival. And in that moment, the weight of 18 years of unresolved disappearances, unrecorded traces, and silent suffering pressed down, not just on him, but on the community, the investigators, the living survivors who had waited for resolution. The past and present converged, exposing every gap, every misstep, every fragment that had once been overlooked. Cara Lynn, alive, speaking, remembering, had transformed the cold case from myth to reality. Harker leaned back in his chair, his calculation now futile. The stories, the patterns, the evidence, they no longer belonged to him. They belonged to the truth. And the truth, once spoken and lived, does not bend. It does not yield. It does not hide. It confronts. It illuminates. And after 18 years of silence, of careful movement through shadows, Daniel Harker was finally exposed to the one force he could never control, the unrelenting persistence of reality. The case was no longer cold. It was alive, vibrant, relentless. And the man who had eluded accountability for nearly 2 decades was finally inside the frame where consequences could no longer be ignored. The pattern had been uncovered, the timeline reconstructed, the survivor's voice heard. And as the room filled with the quiet hum of investigation, voices, lights, movement, one truth crystallized. The past may linger, but it cannot escape forever. And now, the past had arrived. The room didn't feel the same anymore. The air was heavier, quieter. Not the quiet of stillness, but of consequence. The investigation had stopped being a reconstruction of dates and fragments. It had become a reckoning. Daniel Harker was no longer a name on a file or a face in an image. He was a man under scrutiny, trapped in a net woven from years of evidence, testimony, and pattern. Outside, the desert night pressed against the building like an accomplice, silent, unforgiving, distant. But inside, the quiet was different. It was focused, pressurized. It pushed against every word, every hesitation, every truth that hung in the space between what was known and what was about to be revealed. Detectives didn't need to raise their voices anymore. The case had reached a point where pressure didn't come from volume. It came from weight. The weight of history. The weight of survivors. The weight of unanswered questions finally demanding answers. Harker sat motionless, but his gaze shifted as though a part of him was still calculating escape, logic, alternatives. But calculation was no longer the currency he could trade in. Every route had been charted, every timeline traced, every denial met with evidence, and every excuse unraveled by fact. One detective slid a photograph across the table, a grainy image taken from surveillance footage captured during one of Harker's early documented routes. A parking lot. A date handwritten on the corner. June 16, 2001. One day before the disappearance of Lila Mercer. No scene of violence. No graphic moment. Just a figure. A van. And a woman walking toward it. In still frames, the truth was quieter, but more damning. That's Lila, the detective said. Not louder. Not dramatic. Just factual. Harker didn't flinch. Not outwardly. But something in his jaw tightened. Not enough to be visible to anyone else, but enough that investigators, trained to read the smallest shifts, noted it. Lila Mercer didn't walk toward anyone that night, the detective continued. She was on her way to her car. You brought something close enough to be in her path. Silence settled, not as denial, but as consideration. Not defense, just gaze and timing. 2 things that once served him well, but no longer did. You have a chance to explain what that image shows, the detective said. To tell us what happened before, during, and after she reached that van. Harker didn't answer immediately. His eyes moved, not away, but inward, as though he was revisiting memories he had once frozen, compartmentalized, sealed beneath years of routine and silence. Then slowly he spoke. Not a confession. Not a denial. Just truth in fragments. Things changed. He began softly, voice measured but strained. Like metal bending under pressure, it wasn't built to withstand. I didn't plan any of this the way it happened. Another pause. Words edged out like reluctant fragments of a memory long locked away. It started small. Opportunities. Moments. Things that slipped into patterns before I saw them for what they were. His gaze didn't waver. Not exactly guilt. Not exactly resistance. Just acknowledgement. Not in dramatic arcs, not in cinematic confession, but in the quiet space where truth often arrives, incomplete, uneven, and finally unavoidable. Investigators didn't react. No sudden movement. No rising tension. Just presence, calm, steady, persistent. Because at this point, evidence no longer waited on denial. It existed beyond it. There were others, Harker said, almost to himself, not looking at anyone in particular. Before, after. Not all of them survived. Not all of them disappeared in the same way. His words cut through the quiet like cold air. Not graphic, not violent, just fact. Chilling precisely, because it wasn't embellished. "You think this is the part where I break," he said, eyes finally meeting the detective's. "But there's nothing dramatic left to strip away. You already found everything I tried to hide." The implication wasn't an admission of every detail, but it was a surrender to inevitability. Investigators didn't push further in that room. Not yet. Because in moments like this, silence becomes evidence. And Harker's silence, strained and deliberate, wasn't denial anymore. It was weight. It was history speaking through a man who had lived too long with secrets. Outside, teams continued the work, connecting cases, aligning timelines, tracing missing persons reports that now, under this new context, took on haunting patterns. Small towns, desolate areas, late nights, white vans, unmarked, unobserved, until someone connected them, until someone listened, until someone finally saw. Inside the room, the conversation didn't hurry toward confession. It didn't collapse into chaos. It folded into gravity. Because truth, once it reaches a critical point, doesn't explode. It settles. Evenly. And everyone in that room felt it. The weight of what had been discovered. Not just in files. Not just in testimony. But in the space where it always mattered most. Lives. Broken. Interrupted. Reshaped by years of being unknown. Harker knew then that the timeline had trapped him. Not just through evidence, but through narrative. Through structure. Through the voices of those who survived, those who remembered, and those whose absence now carried meaning. And the case, once cold, was now impossible to ignore, unravel, or silence. Because it had become more than evidence. It had become truth in motion. And truth, once released, never stops moving. Not in whispers. Not in shadows. But in the light of revelation that finally refuses to be ignored. The faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead, steady, unwavering, deliberate, marked the beginning of the long night that shifted everything. The interrogation room was no longer just a place for questions and answers. It had become a crucible, a space where truth was no longer optional but inevitable. Daniel Harker sat motionless, but his eyes were alive with calculation, anticipation, fear, and something that felt dangerously close to resignation. He didn't speak yet, but everyone in the room felt it, the calm before the final unraveling. Outside, evidence teams worked methodically in multiple states. Trained personnel, analysts, DNA specialists, cartographers of circumstance, every tool modern investigation could offer was being brought to bear. The cold cases of Nevada, New Mexico, Colorado, and Arizona were no longer separate files. They were a network now, each connected by patterns, timelines, witnesses, and now the man sitting in that interrogation room with lips pressed tight, trying to defend the indefensible. But the defense had started to slip. His composure was still there, but thinner. Frayed. At the edges. A detective slid another photograph across the table. This one older. Older than the June 2001 image of Lila Mercer. Older than any of the surveillance stills they'd shown him before. A timestamp from 1999, Las Vegas suburbs, a convenience store parking lot, grainy footage, but clear enough to make out a vehicle parked oddly, engine running, headlights on, a shadow near the rear. A white van. Unremarkable to most. Significant now. Kara mentioned this. The detective said, voice neutral, unhurried. She remembered the van, the way it felt inside, the smell, the lining you worked with, and she remembers sound. Harker's eyes flickered, not away, not in panic, just in recognition. The detectives didn't rush. They let the silence stretch, the longest weapon in interrogation. She said the sliding door made a noise. The detective continued. A distinct sound. You know that sound. Harker didn't flinch. Not outwardly. But the eyes, just for a moment, shifted. Not denial. Recognition. Which was worse. Because acknowledgement narrows denial's territory. Kara survived. The detective said, gently, as if truth delivered calmly cuts deeper than accusation. And she's remembering more. Not everything yet. Her memory is still settling back into itself. But enough. Enough is a tactical phrase in investigation. Not total, not complete, but sufficient. To corner. Harker didn't speak. So the detective continued. You brought her back from a place no one expected. That location in the desert was only a link, a moment in time. But that van, that method, that wasn't isolated. The detective paused, letting it hang. Then finally, people are alive because of her. A shift. Not dramatic. No tears. No breakdown. Just a slow tightening of features. A man measuring the distance between control and collapse. Harker's voice came low, careful, no defiance, no denial, just a bare articulation of automatic defense mechanisms that had served him for years. You're connecting dots that don't all belong together. But the room stayed still. Composed. Because dots are nothing without lines connecting them, and those lines had begun to solidify. Not through guesswork. Not through assumption. But through evidence. Patterns laid bare, witnesses aligning, fiber matches verified, testimony confirmed, timelines reconstructed, routes mapped, and doors opened that had never been opened before. Harker's eyes narrowed, not in defiance, but in calculation. I was careful, he finally said, voice subdued. I didn't leave anything behind, except the pattern, except the living survivor, except the objects found, except the excavation site and the pendant marked Kara Lynn's initials, except the fibers pulled from years-old evidence, except the connections now spreading outward, except everything investigators had painstakingly reconstructed. He paused, swallowing. I never planned not like this. Not like this. Not one admission. But significant. Context matters in interrogation. Words weigh more when they are fragments of truth attempting denial. You did plan, the detective said simply. You just never expected someone to change the pattern. That sentence, softly spoken, struck deeper than accusation. Because patterns are the language of control, and control is the language of someone who never expects disruption. Disruption like Kara Lynn. Disruption like time. Disruption like evidence that refuses to stay buried. Harker leaned back, eyes distant. Not defeated. Not resigned. Just calculating. Again. Because interrogation is mental warfare. Always has been. But this time, the battlefield wasn't in his mind alone. It was everywhere. Outside the door. At the excavation. In hospital rooms. In databases. In digital timelines. In witness statements. In evidence logs. In cold files labeled unsolved. And each one was now a voice. A truth. An undeniable movement. The detective watched the shift. The tension. The tiny movement in the space between denial and accommodation. Someone who is trapped doesn't break all at once. They fracture in layers. Harker was reaching that moment. Not dramatically. Not emotionally. Subtly. A slip here. A hesitation there. Microexpressions that don't lie. For someone who had relied on invisibility, that's where defeat begins, at the edges of controlled expression. You said things changed, the detective repeated softly, returning to the phrase Harker had uttered earlier. Tell us how. Not about every detail. Not every moment. Just the starting point. The point where control slipped. Where planning ended. Where chaos entered. Where someone like Harker, methodical, controlled, invisible, was confronted with the unexpected. Because truth isn't only about evidence. It's about causation. About turning points. About the moment when a life diverges from the plan. Harker's eyes didn't flick away this time. Not exactly. They settled, not directly into the detective's gaze, just above it, like he was projecting elsewhere, replaying moments, scanning for contradictions, calculating risk, searching memory for defenses he had hidden for years. But memory, once probed by evidence, is no longer fully private. It becomes shared, reconstructed, exposed. And sometimes, The most damaging revelations aren't confessions of guilt. They are confessions of pattern, of repetition, of acknowledgement that the tapestry of years, painstakingly woven in secrecy, was now unraveling thread by thread. Not by force, not by spectacle, but by truth.
Slow.
Relentless. And now, finally observable. Because a cold case is not cold when someone survives to speak. Because a pattern is not locked when direct testimony intersects evidence. Because a man is not invisible when the web he grew so careful in has been fully mapped. And Daniel Harker, in that room, under light, under scrutiny, under the truth, knew it, because silence was no longer an option. Not against memory, not against pattern, not against evidence, not against witness, not against truth itself, because truth, once unearthed, never goes back to sleep. The desert night had given way to early dawn, pale light filtering through blinds, cutting the interrogation room into stripes of shadow and exposure. Daniel Harker's eyes were bloodshot, but alert, scanning, measuring, calculating, though the calculations no longer provided freedom. He had survived this long on precision, patience, and secrecy. But now, the evidence, the testimony, the reconstruction of years of disappearances had formed an unbroken chain. There was nowhere to hide. Every strategy he had relied upon was collapsing under its own weight. Cara Lynn had been brought into a debriefing room nearby, her presence transforming theory into reality. She was being carefully monitored, medically and psychologically, but her words were starting to form, coherent, detailed, and vivid. Each recollection of the van, the sliding door, the polyester lining, the strange desert excavation, each fact she recounted, was a bullet aimed at the invisible network Harker had maintained. Investigators moved silently, cataloging her statements, cross-referencing with evidence, timing, and every trace he had left across decades. Harker had known the possibility of discovery existed, but he had never anticipated survival. Survival was disruptive. It unravels timelines. It forces connections where none were supposed to exist. He realized that every detail he had hidden, every location he had chosen, every fragment he had dismissed as insignificant was now illuminated. And illumination is a weapon that doesn't forget, doesn't tire, and doesn't hesitate. A detective leaned forward, placing a folder on the table. Inside, images of Harker's storage units, of the hidden compartments, of small objects collected over decades, each carefully preserved item cross-referenced with missing persons reports, stared back at him. Jewelry, clothing fragments, a worn watch, keys, photographs, each a piece of the long-forgotten lives that had intersected with his control. And now they were fully visible, fully mapped, fully understood. "You see all of this," the detective said, voice calm, relentless in clarity. "You've kept it hidden for years. You controlled everything. But you didn't anticipate her. She survived. And now the story is no longer yours alone." Harker's jaw tightened. Not with defiance, not with aggression, but with the strain of a man calculating the inevitability he cannot escape. I never meant," he began, voice low, faltering, but the detective didn't respond.
They didn't need to.
Words were no longer the currency, facts were. Presence, objects, testimony, patterns, each element a silent, unyielding accusation. Outside, teams were tracing digital trails, revisiting financial records, checking every surveillance camera within miles of his past known locations. Cell phone pings, fuel receipts, rental records, each verified, each cross-referenced, each proving continuity where Harker had assumed isolation. The web was complete. The system was visible. And Harker, the architect, was trapped within it. Inside, the detective continued. 18 years. 17 unresolved disappearances, multiple locations, countless pieces of evidence overlooked, misfiled, or dismissed. All reconstructed now. All connected. And you're at the center. Harker's eyes shifted, searching for an opening, a flaw, a loophole. But there was none. Every trajectory accounted for. every pattern observed, every silence anticipated. And yet, he was still here, still calculating, still measuring. But calculation alone could no longer erase consequences. A pause. Silence. And then a low, almost imperceptible breath. "I thought I was careful," he said. The words hung in the room like smoke, heavy, slow, inevitable. "I didn't leave a trail. I didn't," he trailed off. No completion, no defense. Just the recognition of exposure. Detectives let it sit. No interruption. No prompting. Because once a man like Harker recognizes the structure is broken, the silence that follows is more revealing than any confession. His mind, trained over decades to manipulate perception, was now processing inevitability. Kara Lynn's voice filtered faintly from the adjacent room, detailing the van, the desert excavation, the sliding door. Each word a thread tugging at the fabric of Harker's control. Each statement punctuated by corroborating evidence, unassailable in its precision. He could hear the cadence, the rhythm, the clarity, and he knew patterns can be reconstructed, timelines reassembled, and control can be shattered. Harker's hands flexed on the table. His control was still visible externally, but internally, the gears had shifted. He had underestimated the persistence of truth, the capacity of a survivor to illuminate a pattern deliberately, patiently hidden over years. Every tactic he had relied on, deception, concealment, patience, was neutralized by the living witness and the reconstruction of evidence, spanning nearly 2 decades. The room seemed to contract around him. Shadows of blinds, silhouettes of investigators, the weight of decades pressing in. The pattern was complete. The timeline was mapped. The survivor's testimony corroborated every fragment. And for the first time, Harker understood that evasion was impossible. Control, once absolute, had fractured irreparably. He leaned back, silent, calculating, and for the first time in years, he did not have the answer. Not a strategy. Not a manipulation. Not a diversion. Only inevitability. Because the cold case, once buried, forgotten, unyielding, was no longer cold. It was alive. And the truth, patient and relentless, had finally caught up. The past, present, and consequence had converged. And Daniel Harker sat at the center, surrounded by every thread, every piece, every voice that had survived, until now, to ensure justice would finally move forward. The room waited. The man waited. The investigation waited. The survivor's voice had spoken. And nothing would ever be the same.